Meg Hillier, Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we all know how important it is to encourage savings because so many people are a paycheck away from poverty. But there's been a lot of discussion about lazy capital in cash-only ISAs, for example, and other savings accounts. And I know there's a drive by government to see greater investment. Would the Minister like to expand on the government's thoughts on this, and particularly if she can make any comments about the security of the cash ISA?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Cash savings provide a vital source of income of savings for a rainy day. We recognise that. But equally, we want to build a better investment culture in our society so that it's not just the 8% of people who can afford financial advice who can have the opportunity of better rewards by investing in British companies and others in our economy.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On that point, it's been widely reported that the Chancellor is planning to slash the amount that savers can save in ISAs from £20,000 to £4,000 per year. Will the Chancellor rule out this punitive measure that will see savings drop and push even more people into income tax?
We are committed to promoting savings and investment, as I said in an earlier answer, and one of the measures that we are looking at is the FCA's review of the advice guidance boundary, because I said in a previous answer, I don't want it just to be the 8% of people who can afford financial advice to reap the rewards of investing in our economy. All taxes under review.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The City of London has been a leader of innovation in the world of finance and savings for a few hundred years now, and it's been successful because it has always seized opportunities and innovation when presented. And in that spirit, we are pleased that the Chancellor, in her Mansion House speak, embraced the concept of securities tokenisation. But we now find that the catalyst of this innovation in the UK, a pilot for the digital gilt instrument known as Digit, has found itself in a 2-year black hole. Innovation is not something that can hang around for 2 years. So can the Minister give assurances that she will do everything she can to deliver Digit as soon as possible?
Thanks, Mr Speaker. It sounds like a criticism of the previous government. I can reassure the honourable gentleman that we are committed to innovation and indeed committed to Digit.
Louise Jones.
Number 2, Mr Speaker.
Chancellor.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I should like to answer this question together with question 18. Economic growth is the #1 mission of this government. Putting more money in people's pockets and ensuring growth is felt in all regions of the UK is a core part of our mission. The government has a clear focus on investing in the infrastructure needed to support cities and regions to grow and thrive. In January, the government announced a partnership between East Midlands Airport and Prologis to build a new advanced manufacturing and logistics park, unlocking up to £1 billion of private investment and 2,000 jobs at the airport site.
Louise Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The town of Staveley in my constituency of North East Derbyshire hosts one of the 3 sites for the East Midlands Investment Zone, which is a fantastic opportunity for us. However, the Chesterfield-Staveley regeneration route is vital to making the most of this site and is something long campaigned for by my colleague, the Honourable Friend MP for Chesterfield, and it is a huge priority for my constituents. Will the Treasury work with us and our excellent East Midlands Mayor Claire Ward to bring this hugely beneficial project to fruition?
I thank my honourable friend for that question and the work that she does alongside with the honourable member, my honourable friend for Chesterfield, to campaign for things that will boost local growth in the area of North East Derbyshire and also in Chesterfield. Regarding the Chesterfield-Staveley regeneration route, the scheme is being considered by the Department for Transport, and I will suggest to the Minister for Roads that he meets with the relevant members as well as the Mayor for the East Midlands, Claire Ward.
Jane Craft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government's decision to increase defence spending is not only an ironclad commitment to national security in the face of generational challenges, but also an investment in British industry, able to unlock new jobs and opportunities across the country. Industry in the east of England has a significant defence sector, receiving £1.5 billion of government investment last year. So can the Chancellor clarify how the additional defence funding has the potential to benefit my constituents in Thurrock as well as the wider region?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and she is absolutely right that defence has a very important role to play in the growth mission as well as keeping our country safe and secure. On Friday, the Defence Secretary and myself hosted a roundtable at RAF Waddington in Lincoln to announce a new Defence Innovation Hub to harness this potential. And Defence has a strong presence in so many of our constituencies. Indeed, in the east of England, the MOD spending accounted for £1.5 billion, according to the most recent data. And down the road from my honourable friend's constituency in Thurrock is, of course, the historic MOD Shoebury Ness range. MOD and Kinetic operate this site and others as part of a long-term partnership worth over £5 billion. And in the years to come, there will be more investment in defence from both the public and the private sector.
Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the government's ever-elusive pursuit of economic growth, it has rebranded the UK Infrastructure Bank as the National Wealth Fund. Even the OBR has cast doubt on the effectiveness of this as a driver for economic growth. Can the Chancellor tell the House how much this rebrand has cost?
Chancellor.
The National Wealth Fund is doing important work ensuring that we can leverage in private sector investment. The most recent investments include in mining in Cornwall, in energy charging points in our road infrastructure, and just at the end of last week I announced that the National Wealth Fund will now play a more important role in funding and supporting investments in our defence sector, which is going to be even more important in the years ahead.
Anderson.
I recently visited a business in Kirkby in Ashfield in the East Midlands. Funnily enough, I didn't see the honourable member for Strangford at the time, but this business told me that the increase in national insurance contributions is going to cost them £240,000 a year, which will stop them recruiting people and giving their employees a pay rise next year. So does the Chancellor agree with me? It's time to reverse this ridiculous decision and help drive growth in the East Midlands.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the budget in October, I had to fill the £22 billion plaque hole left by the previous government. But there are huge opportunities to grow the economy in the East Midlands. We've recently agreed the £9 billion Unity deal with Rolls-Royce to support the Royal Navy submarine fleet. This is a major boost for economic growth in the East Midlands, creating and maintaining 5,000 long-term jobs. Good for our country's security, good for the people of the East Midlands.
Monica Harding.
Question 3, please, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer this question together with question number 20. The government has taken difficult decisions to repair the public finances, to fund public services and to restore economic stability. The OBR expects the employer national insurance contribution changes will reduce the level of potential output by 0.1% at the forecast horizon. The OBR forecasts growth to pick up next year and living standards to grow faster during this Parliament than the previous one. In the long term, the OBR expects the autumn budget policies, if sustained, to permanently increase the size of the economy.
Monica Harding.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Alison runs Stepping Stones Nursery, which has been operating in my constituency of East Walton for 30 years, offering wraparound care for busy families. The increase to employers' national insurance alone will cost them £16,000 per year, and they're still struggling with an increase in utility costs. And this is in the context of nurseries in the area struggling and closing. And Headmasters, a hairdresser in Walton, is struggling with £15,000 of extra cost, primarily due to this tax rise. So can the Minister explain to businesses in Eastern Walton how this government's national insurance policy will deliver growth or higher living standards, because it seems to be doing neither?
Mr. Speaker, the government's decision to increase employer national insurance contributions was one of the toughest decisions we took at the budget, but it was necessary to restore stability to the public finances, because it is only on the basis of having stable public finances and fiscal responsibility that we can boost investment and growth that will make people across Britain better off.
Nera Wilson.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. As the poor growth figures show, the Chancellor's jobs tax is really hurting businesses, not least our hospitality sector. Pubs like the Eel Pie and the King's Head, as well as family-run restaurant Shambles in my constituency, are really struggling with soaring costs, putting off hiring people. So if the Chancellor won't reverse her jobs tax, will she at the very least consider extending the current 75% business rates relief for hospitality until the new system she's announced is in place?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member speaks about business rates relief. We've got to remember, of course, that the business rates relief for retail, hospitality and leisure was due to end entirely in April 2025 under the plans we inherited from the party opposite when we were in government. Despite the tough fiscal context, we decided to extend that relief, that 40%, for another year before the permanently lower rates for retail, hospitality and leisure come in from April 2026.
Dan Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that planning reform is essential for higher growth and lower taxes? And I'd like to ask, is he, like me, concerned that the anti-growth opposition we see before us in this House will vote against the forthcoming planning and infrastructure bill, possibly the most significant piece of pro-growth legislation this Parliament will see in decades?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he's absolutely right about the centrality of the planning reform to getting the economy growing. Indeed, one of the first actions the Chancellor announced upon taking office was to scrap the ban on onshore wind turbines in the planning system, which have been holding back our clean energy transition. I hope that some of the members of the opposition might take the opportunity during today's questions to confirm they will support our reforms to the planning system, because they are indeed vital to growth in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that it is in the interests of business to see waiting lists in the NHS reduced, to see our roads repaired and to see the public finances fixed? And does he agree that if the parties opposite don't agree with Labour's plans, they should set out how they would pay for these improvements?
My honourable friend is absolutely right that the stability in the public finances are crucial to make sure that we boost investment and growth across the country. And he's also right to point out that having public services which are back on their feet after years of decline under the party opposite being in government is also essential to not only making people in this country healthier, more able to get around and better off, but to getting our economy growing, because it is on that basis that businesses will invest.
Shadow Minister James White.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Even before Labour's jobs tax comes into force, we can see the damage it's doing, and 750,000 jobs in hospitality will be subject to employer national insurance for the first time, costing £1 billion. So when major hospitality and retail businesses are warning that the lower paid and part-time workers will suffer most, will the Chancellor think again, and can the Minister at least commit there will be no further increases during this Parliament?
Mr. Speaker, the businesses the honourable gentleman referred to, like businesses in all sectors of the economy, benefit from the stability which this government has brought to the economy. And if he wants to talk about unemployment, if he wants to talk about the rate of jobs, we recognise that the changes to employer national insurance contributions were a tough decision that will have consequences. But the unemployment rate will fall to 4.1% next year and remain low until 2029. And when taken together, the budget measures mean that the employment level in this country will increase from 33.1 million in 2024 to 34.3 million in 2029.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Health and wealth are two sides of the same coin, and we will not get economic growth without a healthy population. But as a result of the national insurance contribution changes, the Care Provider Alliance reports that 73% of social care providers will have to refuse new care packages from local authorities or the NHS, and 57% will have to hand back existing contracts. Mr. Speaker, what assurances can the government provide to the huge number of people who are very scared that they will have to go without care and see their lives deteriorate?
Good question. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes an important point, but it is also important to point out that tough decisions on taxation have to be made to fund those very services which she is keen to support. However, to her point specifically, to support social care authorities to deliver key services in light of the pressures, we announced at the Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement a further £200 million for adult and children's social care. This will be allocated by the Social Care Grant, which will bring the total increase in this grant in 25-26 to £880 million, meaning that up to £3.7 billion of additional funding will be provided to social care authorities in 25-26.
Daisy Cooper.
Mr. Speaker, ministers will be aware of analysis from the Nuffield Trust that shows that additional grant has been dwarfed by the additional costs that the government is introducing. But on the Great British High Street, we know that our high streets are beautiful features of our cities, market towns and villages. But hospitality, retail, beauty and other service sectors are saying that the combination of national insurance and other changes will be a real hammer blow. If high street shops start to close. That is bad for economic growth and it's also bad for confidence. So what mechanisms will ministers put in place to monitor the impact of the national insurance contribution changes on the vibrancy and resilience of our high streets?
Well, Mr. Speaker, all measures in the budget were, of course, analysed by the Treasury and the OBR ahead of their announcement, and we keep in constant contact with industry representatives to see how policies are taking place in practice. But I would draw her attention to my earlier remarks to her honourable friend in relation to our business rates reform, which is a vital ask from the retail, hospitality and leisure sector. And after years of chopping and changing from the party opposite, changing reliefs one year to the next, offering no stability whatever to people in that sector, we are introducing permanently lower rates for retail, hospitality and leisure from April 26 and avoiding the complete end of relief that the party opposite left in the in-tray when we arrived in office.
Kevin Bonavia.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I should like to answer this question together with question number 5. The growth mission is the central mission of this government and transport an important enabler of that growth. The spending review delivered a £1.1 billion cash increase to the transport budget in 25-26 compared to 24-25, representing a 1.5% real terms growth with record spending. Further announcements will be made in the spending review.
Kevin Bonavia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, Stevenage Borough Council are working to secure jobs and opportunity with town centre regeneration underway and over 590 council homes delivered. But outdated infrastructure is holding back growth. Businesses have been clear with me that upgrading Stevenage Station Gateway will unlock growth with a prospect of 15,000 jobs to be delivered and £1.5 billion benefit to the economy each year. So will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can make the most of this opportunity to unlock economic growth through more infrastructure investment?
My honourable friend is absolutely right that investing in infrastructure will enable growth in towns, villages and cities across the whole of our United Kingdom. We will set out further detail alongside the spending review in our 10-year infrastructure strategy in June. And no doubt Stevenage being sited between London and the Oxford-Cambridge corridor will be benefiting enormously from announcements already made. But decisions on specific schemes will be taken by DfT following the spending review.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Midlands Rail Hub is a project which would represent major investment in rail infrastructure across the West Midlands and would crucially mean more frequent trains on the cross-city line which serves Lichfield. Before the pandemic, this was the busiest commuter line in the country outside of London. What assurances can the ministers give to me and my constituents that more trains on this line are going to be coming and coming soon?
I thank my honourable friend, who's a strong champion for his constituency and for raising this project with us here in the House today. Rail projects such as the case he's made in his constituency will be an important part of our consideration in the months ahead as part of the spending review, and I'll arrange for him to meet with the appropriate Transport Minister as we make those considerations.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The great university cities of York and Hull are unusual in that they do not have a direct rail line between them. Labour MPs, Liberal Democrat councillors, Conservatives, everyone in the whole region is united in believing that reopening the Beverley to York line so that the two great minsters of Hull and York can be reconnected would bring economic growth and a brighter future for the area. Would the Minister agree to meet with me and colleagues to discuss this project and how it could help unlock the growth which we all seek across the House?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that the right honourable gentleman failed to persuade his party-winning government to open that line over the last 14 years, but I can give him reassurances that this government takes rail infrastructure seriously, and I'll happily consider any detail he wishes to write to me about.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, the economic growth through infrastructure development could be helped in Scotland and Northern Ireland with more money going to the Cairn-Ryan port and the road infrastructure to there. Allied with that, any help that the Department and the Minister and the Chancellor could do on resolving the EU-related trading issues would considerably help Northern Ireland business as well as Scottish business.
The honourable member will know that the government has entered negotiations with our counterparts in the European Commission to improve trade between the UK and the European Union. I had a great meeting last week in Cardiff with finance ministers from the Northern Ireland Executive as well as from Scotland and Wales to discuss these issues and noted that we have given a record-breaking increase in funding to the devolved government so that they can get on with projects such like this, working in partnership with us where we have responsibility still.
Stringer.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Number 6.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I should like to answer this together with question number 16. At Autumn Budget 2024, we set out the first major steps in our approach to regional growth through devolution, investment and reform, and the January Growth Speech regional investment package built on this. We have made clear the government's focus on attracting inward investment across the country and to investing in infrastructure needed to support cities and regions to grow. We have made it clear that the importance of investing in major city regions across the UK will play an important part in this endeavour. For example, if we improve the productivity gap in Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds, we estimate we could deliver an extra £33 billion in economic output.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was nearly as shocked as when you just called me then, listening to the Chancellor of the Exchequer on Radio 4 talking about economic growth, when she said there hadn't been a new runway built in this country since 1945. Manchester Airport would be very surprised to hear that, because the new runway there has been operating for nearly 25 years. I was shocked by that, but not really surprised, because I think many of the officials in the Treasury who advise her show a startling ignorance of the English regions. And that leads to certain prejudice in the formula they use for calculating whether a scheme should go ahead. Can the Treasury Minister and the rest of the Treasury team provide coaches to send Treasury officials round the English regions to talk to people who know about growth there? And secondly, will he look at the formulas that are biased against the regions that decide where economic growth happens?
I thank my honourable friend for his questions. I will do my best to answer them. I can confirm that Treasury officials routinely engage with local and regional officials across the country, including frequently in Manchester with Mayor Burnham and his team. I would point him gently to some of the announcements made by the Chancellor, including support for the Old Trafford development in Manchester, and of course congratulate the operators at Manchester Airport for running a successful business, which we will continue to support in the normal way.
Michelle Strachan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the autumn budget, the government announced a range of support measures for small businesses, including vital support for retail, hospitality and leisure sectors. Will you confirm the measures being taken to support the independent and important craft brewing and distillery sector in Cumbria?
I thank my honourable friend for her question. As the House has already heard today from my colleague, we have made permanent decisions to give businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors security around knowing that their discounts will apply to business rates relief for the long term, not just on a one-year rolling temporary basis, as has been the case for years under the last government. And I understand from my honourable friend that the likes of Shed One Gin, Wolftown and Kin Vodka in Cumbria will benefit enormously from this government's policy, and I look forward to visiting with her those establishments in due course.
Max Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Golden Valley development in Cheltenham will bring significant growth to the West. It will also back our national security by supporting GCHQ. Now the Chancellor has approved 0.1% of extra defence spending to go for intelligence and cyber. Will the Chancellor work with colleagues in the MOD, DCIT and the Cabinet Office to agree more funding for this nationally significant development? And if the defence point isn't good enough, it's also going to unlock a lot of nice new houses as well.
I thank the honourable member for his question. I was on a visit to Newport last week with Airbus, looking at some of the advanced technologies we have in this space, and they told me about the important connections between Newport and his region with GCHQ and the industrial impact that has on the supply chain in the UK. The increased spending, and that's by the Prime Minister, in defence will have a significant positive impact for businesses such as those and for his region, and we'll look forward to setting out further details of that spending in the spending review.
Morgan.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Marches region, of which North Shropshire is a significant part, is held back by the road between Llanymynech and Oswestry in my constituency, which is very dangerous, the A483. It holds back local growth because there are frequent crashes and hold-ups on it, and obviously it's a danger to life for people who live in the area. Can the Minister work with his colleagues in the Department for Transport to ensure that we get vital improvements on that road if we can't have a bypass?
I thank the honourable member for her question. I can commit to working with DFT colleagues on projects such as this and others around the country as we make decisions in the upcoming spending review. I will just make an observation that it's not just about the decisions around spending. It's been a problem in the past where decisions have been made and then U-turned and made and then U-turned. It's difficult for the supply chain, difficult for investors and local communities. And in our multi-year capital budgets and our 10-year infrastructure strategy coming in the months ahead, we will give stability to the UK economy so that we can get on and deliver projects such as the one she mentioned.
Shadow Minister Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor has lauded the new National Wealth Fund as being a key part of their regional growth ambitions. The trouble is, it isn't actually new. It's just the UK Infrastructure Bank with a new colour scheme and £7 billion it didn't need. The Prime Minister announced at a recent Labour Party political conference that he will allocate £200 million for Grangemouth from the National Wealth Fund. But it's supposed to be operationally independent. So can he confirm that that is still the case? Was the full independent investment process followed? And can he confirm that the unexpected resignation of the National Wealth Fund CEO just days before that announcement is not connected?
I find it odd, Mr. Speaker, that members on the benches opposite don't welcome an additional £7 billion of investment into our economy. It's rather a testament to their poor performance on investment over many, many years in a government. To answer the specific questions, I can confirm that each of the business cases in relation to Grangemouth will have to go through the normal process for sign-off, and that John Flint leaving the National Wealth Fund is not in any way connected to decisions taken by this government, and we look forward to making an appointment for his successor in due course.
Murray Glendon.
Mr. Speaker.
Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an important question when, shockingly, household incomes in the North East hardly grew over the long 14 years of the last Conservative government. We need to raise public and private investment, which is why we're working with the North East Combined Authority on their local growth plan. And the Office for Investment is working particularly closely with the North East, alongside Liverpool, on developing local growth opportunities.
Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the town's access to the world's biggest offshore wind farm, a cluster of advanced manufacturing firms and an expanding energy skills academy, more of Newcastle upon Tyne East and Wallsend potential is yet to be tapped into. What discussions is the Minister having with the Energy Secretary to ensure that the investment is there and green supply chains are anchored in places like Tyneside?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spent far too much of my life talking to the now Energy Secretary, but the honourable member is completely right to highlight the potential of green energy supply chains in her constituency and across the North East. This is a government committed to securing the economic gains alongside energy security from the energy transition, in stark contrast to the previous government that thought the net zero transition was something to create dividing lines out of, not jobs.
Cat Smith.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Moving on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At budget, the government announced major steps towards delivering a once-in-a-generation increase in social housing. This included a £500 million boost to the Affordable Homes programme, increasing annual spend to £3.1 billion, which is the biggest annual budget for affordable housing in over a decade. Earlier this month, the government also announced an additional £350 million to fund affordable homes. Mr. Speaker, this is the difference a Labour government can make to people waiting desperately on the waiting list for secure housing across the country. Further investment decisions will be set out at Phase 2 of the spending review.
Catherine Smith.
I thank the Minister for his reply, and will he join me in paying tribute to the Lancaster Guardian for their recent investigative report into the reality for many families in the Lancaster district living in temporary accommodation. This is paired with a frustration I hear from local house builders and developers about the delays in the planning process in the district in order to build those homes. Is there anything further the Minister thinks that can happen in Lancaster that would help ensure that families in the district actually had secure housing?
I thank my honourable friend. She knows that we're doing everything possible in this place to streamline and improve the planning legislation and the planning processes, with clear signals to everybody across the country that we need to build and build rapidly, not least for our housing targets. Local councils play an important role in this process, as we know, to make decisions for local development. And I understand that in Lancaster City Council, my honourable friend has had some struggles with the Green Party in becoming blockers as opposed to builders. I would say to them and to people across the country, they need to get behind the build agenda, because that is what the British people voted for.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. To what extent is the Chancellor concerned about multiple potential breaches by HMRC of its charter since it issued Spotlight 63, which impacts rental housing supply and is causing real concerns amongst my constituents who have met me, both landlords and tenants, and would the Minister meet with me to urgently discuss these issues around Spotlight 63?
I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I have no idea what the answer is, but if the honourable gentleman writes to me, I'll make sure he gets an answer.
Nigel Calliscar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I just press the Minister a little bit more about... Oh, number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is committed to spending taxpayers' money efficiently. At autumn budget, we launched the Office for Value for Money to realise benefits from every pound of public spending. Through phase 1 of the spending review, departments will set a 2% productivity, efficiency and savings target to ensure that every pound of taxpayer money is well spent. The next phase of the spending review has gone further. I have asked each department to conduct a line-by-line review of existing day-to-day budgets to identify where spending is no longer aligned with this government's priority or is poor value for money.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Minister for his answer? As a member of the Public Accounts Committee, I see on a weekly basis the waste that was under the previous government, from billions spent on badly procured COVID contracts to a Rwanda scheme that delivered nothing. Can I press the Minister for the steps he will be taking to make sure that we deal with not only value for money for the taxpayer, but also the legacy of waste under the previous government?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and members on the benches opposite are chuntering, but it's their legacy. Not once in 17 years was a zero-based review done. Not once did ministers, former ministers opposite require their departments to go line by line through their budgets. Not once did they think that it was a responsible thing to do to be able to go through and check how every pound of taxpayers' money was spent. Instead, it was an argument each year. How much more money am I going to get? How much more borrowing is there going to be to pay for these bills? How many more promises am I going to make, which I know I will not deliver? The British people were sick to death of that approach to politics, and this government is taking a fundamentally different approach.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund provides excellent value for money in mid-Sussex at Beacon House, which is a specialist mental health and trauma clinic. But unfortunately, their financial future is looking uncertain at the moment. Does the Minister agree with me that investing in mental health is always a good idea in terms of getting people back to work and well again and able to contribute to society? And will the Minister work with the Department of Education to secure future funding for this vital service?
I thank the honourable member for her question. I agree with her entirely that mental health services are in desperate need of investment and support across the country. The evidence is very clear that there are too many people, for example, who are out of work, who would like to be in work, but are waiting at home unwell, unable to receive the support and services that they need and that they deserve. The Health Secretary is working hard on this at the moment. We're going into the spending review negotiations over the coming weeks and months, and we'll set out further detail in due course and look forward to be able to provide more information specifically as we go through that process.
The Minister Richard Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Improving public sector productivity was the #1 ask of Institute of Director businesses trying to weather Storm Rachel. But under Labour, public sector productivity has fallen further behind pre-pandemic levels. The number of civil servants working from home under Labour has gone up. And shockingly, under Labour, as the Daily Telegraph found, thousands of civil servants are being signed off to work from abroad. So whether it's civil servants working from their bedrooms or from Benidorm or for other blockers of public sector productivity, what has the Chief Secretary actually done in his last 8 months in office, or is he too comfortable with what the Prime Minister calls the tepid bath of managed decline?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. I think my #1 ask is he has another go at making better jokes in future. But to answer the substance of his question, I agree with the honourable member that the state is not productive enough on a whole range of issues. He talked about civil service headcount. He talked about government offices and locations. He talked about working conditions. He could also talk, for example, about digital transformation. Quite frankly, there is an enormous amount of work which will become evident through our spending review. It's something that we are taking very seriously, not just in the Treasury, but from the Prime Minister downwards. And I look forward to him reflecting on what we suggest is the answer to 14 years of failure from his party when he was in government.
Sir Desmond Swin.
Number 10, sir.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the autumn, I took the decisions to put our public finances back on a firm footing. The most recent GDP data showed the economy grew by 0.4% in the last month of last year, and our fiscal rules, as I've said on many occasions, are non-negotiable. The party opposite sent mortgage rates and business borrowing costs spiralling. We've returned stability to the public finances to give families and businesses the stability that they need.
Sir Desmond.
The servicing cost is now twice what we're spending on defence, which she's right to be increasing. So what is her level of ambition for finding savings, say, in the welfare budget?
I absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman that we need to get a grip of the welfare budget that got out of control under the previous Conservative government. But frankly, Mr Speaker, I'm not going to take lectures from the party opposite that crashed the economy. And let me remind the House what the right honourable gentleman said about the disastrous mini-budget. He said, "I share entirely the free market ideology that underpins the Chancellor's statement. The Chancellor was right to be radical." He added, "I rejoice at the two fingers the Chancellor has raised to socialist dogma and envy." Well, I think that the financial markets and British public have united in their view on the previous government.
Lynn Stewart.
Question 11, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With your permission, I would like to answer this question together with question number 11 and 15. Economic growth is the #1 mission of this government, and Scotland will play an important role. At autumn budget, we announced that the Scottish Government will be provided with £47.7 billion in its settlement in 2025-26, the largest in real terms in the history of devolution. We also confirmed £130 million of targeted funding, including for city and growth deals.
Lynn Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In Scotland, we have seen almost 2 decades of wasteful spending, while public services get worse. Does the Minister agree with me that good public services are essential to economic growth? And does he agree that taxpayers in Scotland are not getting good value for their money under the SNP government?
I thank my honourable friend for her question. On my recent visit to Scotland, I heard just that. The people of Scotland deserve the same approach that the people of England is getting from this government, a government with stability, with economic growth at its mission, and with getting a grip on public finances after years of failure. Quite frankly, Mr Speaker, we've given the Scottish Government the money. They now need to get on with the job, and if they can't, they need to move out of the way.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure my right honourable friend will agree with me on the importance of Scotch whisky industry. Support for the industry starts at home by attracting investment, including at the Port of Leith distillery in my Edinburgh North and Leith constituency, which is producing single malt Scotch whisky, attracting tourists and showcasing the best of Scottish hospitality. My right honourable friend will be aware of the concerns from the industry about the watering down of the definition of single malt, which will have an impact on investment and growth. Will she therefore work with Cabinet colleagues to ensure that no changes made to the definition of single malt that would undermine the Scottish success story and investment in the Scottish whisky industry?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Scotch whisky is a proud British brand and export, and this government will always support the industry. I've checked with DEFRA ministers and can confirm to my honourable friend that we will not be watering down the definition of single malt whisky.
Stone. Oh, wait, not.
Mr Speaker, you will have seen the film Skyfall, in which James Bond and M travel up the A9. But the A9 is a killer road, and we've had a litany of broken promises from the SNP government that is hardly conducive to economic growth in Scotland.
I thank the honourable member for his tour of the scenic A9 and the importance of this road to Scotland, and I would, I'm sure, support what would have been his question, which is that the Scottish National Party in government in Scotland ought to take infrastructure seriously, as we are here from the UK government. And thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We can listen to the braying from Labour MPs in Scotland, or we can look at the facts, and the facts are that the Scottish economy grew 12% more than the UK economy did in 2024. That's because of the SNP Scottish Government forensic focus on making Scotland the most attractive place in the UK for FDI year after year, for having a progressive taxation system, for rewarding our public sector workers properly, and for investing in our communities. What difference does he think that business agricultural property relief and business property relief will have on the Scottish economy? Positive or negative?
I thank the honourable member for his question. Of course, when we make changes to taxes, even when that is difficult, it results in additional funding for him and his colleagues to spend. And I'm sure he's grateful that we've given a record-breaking increase into investment into the Scottish Government. And he may not be grateful for nothing and may be agitating in his place, but I suggest he goes back to the people of Scotland and explains his record in government.
Julia Lopez.
Question number 12, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Government is committed to keeping taxes on working people as low as possible, which is why we are not increasing the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax, employee national insurance contributions or VAT. The Government has published tax information and impact notes for tax policy changes made at budget, which give a clear explanation of the policy objective together with details of the tax impact on individuals. The OBR publishes an economic and fiscal outlook alongside budget, which sets out their assessment of the effect of government decisions taken on tax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, borrowing costs are soaring, the economy is weakening, and we need to spend much more on defence. Now, in these circumstances, can people be absolutely confident that to meet her fiscal rules, the Chancellor will not be raising income tax in the course of this Parliament?
Mr. Speaker, the OBR spring forecast will take place on March the 26th and will be accompanied by a statement to Parliament from the Chancellor. Ahead of the statement responding to the forecast, the Government will not give a running commentary on economic developments, but I reassure her that the Chancellor's commitment, and indeed the whole Government's commitment to our fiscal rules, is non-negotiable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, it shouldn't be working people that pay more tax, because wealth inequality is growing in the UK, and improving living standards is what ultimately this Government will be judged on. So, does the Chancellor see the merit in introducing an annual wealth tax of 2% on people with over £10 million worth of assets, which would go an awful long way in raising £26 billion per annum to equalise society?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope my honourable friend will welcome the £200 million investment in Grangemouth facility, which we've spoken about during this debate already today. And I hope he will also support the decisions the Government has taken to restore fiscal responsibility to public finances within the tough fiscal rules that the Chancellor set out at budget.
John Cooper.
Question number 13, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Economic stability and growth are vital to help businesses across the UK to grow. The Lloyds Business Barometer, published last week, showed business confidence up 12 points, building on recent surveys by EY and PwC that show that business and investor confidence is rising. This Government is partnering with business to unlock investment and to drive growth.
John Cooper.
Mr. Speaker, with her unimpeachable record in the sector, the Chancellor will know that economics is known as the dismal science. And as a member of the Business and Trade Committee, I've spoken directly with businesses one-to-one, and rather than second-hand statistics, the mood is indeed dismal. After her dud budget, can she think again, go back on this desperate jobs tax? The Chancellor is in danger of becoming tough on growth and tough on the causes of growth.
Well, honourable members on the benches opposite welcome the additional money for the NHS, but they never welcome the means to pay for it, which is why we are in the mess that we are in with the £22 billion black hole that we inherited from the previous government. But he says that these are backward-looking surveys. The EY survey of UK CEOs found 82% felt optimistic. The PwC's latest Global CEO survey ranked the UK as the second most attractive global destination for international investment. And the Lloyds survey last week showed a boost in business confidence. Those are the facts. People are choosing Britain as a place to invest and to locate their business. On this side of the House, we welcome that.
We now come to topicals. Josh Newbury.
Number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Is it? Normally.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the world is changing, which is why we must bring about a new era of security and renewal to keep our country safe. Last week, I convened European finance ministers at the G20 to discuss our shared challenges. I set out that national security will always be the first responsibility of this government, as well as national security being the bedrock for economic prosperity. I was also proud to welcome President Zelensky to Downing Street alongside the Prime Minister at the weekend, where we signed a loan agreement that will deliver £2.26 billion in funding to Ukraine above our other commitments to bolster their military capacity,
repaid by the profits from frozen Russian sovereign assets. We will use the additional investment into defence to create more good jobs, paying decent wages in all parts of the UK. And that is why we are giving the National Wealth Fund a new strategic steer to invest in technologies that better support our security and defence. Britain is a strong country with strong defences, and I know that we can weather this changing world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a father of a 5-year-old, I know firsthand how important indoor play facilities are. Providers in Cannock Chase, like the Beach Hut in Norton Keynes and the Kids Rule Play Cafe in Cannock, have written to me asking for consideration for a sector-specific VAT reduction and the opportunity to shape the reform of business rates. Would a Treasury Minister be willing to meet with me, local providers and the Association of Indoor Play to discuss the sector's priorities?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. In terms of VAT, the government has no plans to consider zero rating for indoor play facilities, but all tax breaks must be value for money, and evidence suggests that these savings are only partially passed on. I would, however, welcome my honourable friend engaging with us as we look to inform our Transforming Business Rates paper ahead of the budget later this year.
Chancellor of the Exchequer Melstride.
How many jobs will the Right Honourable Lady destroy as a result of her jobs tax?
No Shakespeare, Mel.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for that question. I know that he would have looked at the OBR forecast from the budget last year. They forecast that employment will rise in this Parliament, unemployment will fall and real household disposable income will increase. That's a far cry from the last Parliament, which was the worst Parliament on record for living standards.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady didn't reference the fact that the OBR also said that there would be 50,000 fewer jobs as a result of the next increase, and indeed Bloomberg put that figure at 130,000 jobs. It does not need to be this way, Mr. Speaker. On the 26th of March, the Right Honourable Lady should come to this House with a spring statement. She should come with a clear plan around welfare savings, which we had when we were in government. And would she now confirm that she is prepared to do that with our support and put an end to this pernicious tax increase?
What the Right Honourable Gentleman and his party had was 14 years to reform the welfare system. They failed to do so. This government will. We are turning the British economy round after the disaster left to us by the previous government. 3 cuts in interest rates since the general election. Real wages rising at their fastest rate for 3 years. Fuel duty frozen, the pay slips of working people protected, and millions getting a pay rise through an increase in the national living wage. That is the change that this government is delivering. That is the change that they're blocking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During his recent visit to Burton, His Majesty the King sampled one of Tower Brewery's excellent beers, putting our rich brewing heritage in the spotlight. Even though His Majesty and I like a tipple, low and no alcohol sales are up 610% since 2013, with a clear opportunity to support this growing sector while promoting public health. Can the Chancellor give consideration to raising the alcohol-free threshold to 0.5 ABV in line with international markets to improve consumer choice and growth?
Answer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He is a fantastic campaigner for the breweries in his constituency, and we want the drink sector to go from strength to strength. We are reviewing the responses to the consultation on the threshold that he mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oxfordshire has no nighttime cover for palliative care, meaning patients must dial 111 and wait hours for urgent pain relief to arrive. Will the Minister commit to increasing funding to the Department for Health and Social Care so ICBs, including the Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and Berkshire West ICB, can deliver palliative care round the clock?
This government, as the honourable member will know, has already given £26 billion of additional funding to the National Health Service and additional funding to MHCLG for social care. We know we've got more to do. The government's working hard on that, and we'll set out further details in due course.
Whereas, Mr. Speaker, under this Labour government, Cornish tin mining is back. Following the recent Wealth Fund investment in South Crofty Tin Mine at the centre of my Camborne, Redruth and Hale constituency, does the Chancellor agree with me that in doubling the National Wealth Fund investment, this is a perfect example of how public funding should be used to unlock private investment in a strategically vital industry?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and unlike the party opposite, we believe that investing alongside private industry is good for jobs and good for economic growth. I visited the National Wealth Fund's offices last month and I heard first-hand from them about their equity investment in Cornish metals. This will help to finance the reopening of Cornwall's South Crofty tin mine, creating more than 300 local jobs. And
Order! Look, enough is enough. I've got to get these other members in on both sides. I'm sorry that the front bench doesn't want to get the members in. I am determined to. So it is called topicals. That means it's topical. I want quick answers and certainly short answers to the question. Let's come to the Father House, Sir Edmund Lee.
Yeah. I hope I won't damage the Chancellor if I commend the fiscally conservative way she's increasing defence spending. Given that if every European country matches our 2.5% commitment, we can release over £150 billion worth of defence spending. Does she agree that we can crack this because war and peace is always won ultimately by the size of the economy?
Yeah. I very much agree with the honourable gentleman. That's why I met with fellow European finance ministers in Cape Town at the G20 last week. All of Europe needs to step up. The British government is doing so. We need to see that from other countries too.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Acknowledging that ODA will go down to 0.3% of GNI in 2027, can ministers confirm whether ODA will remain at 0.5% for the calendar year of 2026, which will help ensure that UK aid keeps the maximum number of people alive for the longest possible time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Impacts on ODA budgets are currently under review by the government. Our commitment is to prioritise legal obligations and minimise disruption, and we'll confirm details in due course. But I'll happily meet with the honourable member and colleagues to discuss this further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Expanding UK airport capacity has a very shaky case for economic benefits because business efficiency is not increasing its use of air travel, and the UK sends 3 times as many tourists out by plane as we welcome in. Could the Chancellor urgently publish her evidence for any net benefits to the economy from airport expansion so it can be carefully examined?
I think we have to decide, Mr. Speaker, whether we're for growth or against growth. This government is for growth, and we will set out further details about this particular project when the developers come forward with their plans for the government to consider.
Michelle Scroggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous government's mismanagement has left our flood defences unfit for purpose, and this is having a huge impact on my constituents. Will the Chancellor set out what the government is doing to increase community resilience against flooding and coastal erosion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ensure we protect the country from the devastating impacts of flooding, we've committed £2.65 billion over 24-25 to 25-26 to improve flood defences, and we've established a flood resilience task force to feed into our decisions for future spending, which will report in due course.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, Bridgewater's 77 pubs, including the Crossways Inn in West Huntsville, are at the heart of our local communities. Yet the sector overpays £500 million in business rates relative to turnover. So will the Chancellor commit to the British Beer and Pub Association's call for a 20p cut in the small business multiplier, 15p off the standard multiplier, in order to secure the future of British pubs?
Mr. Speaker, we have, of course, frozen the small business multiplier this year and will be introducing permanently lower multipliers for retail, hospitality and leisure premises from April 26, which will benefit pubs. In the meanwhile, they also benefit from our decision to increase the duty relief for draft products.
Chris Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is this government doing to ensure innovation UK tech companies like KO Park in my constituency of Harlow so it can drive economic growth as part of world-class AI computer ecosystems?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Harlow is home to one of the world's, the UK's largest supercomputers, and we're taking forward the AI Action Plan, and we've also got the Tech Adoption Review, which will look at how we can unlock the potential of our AI in our high-growth sectors.
So Oliver Dalton.
Attracting high net worth individuals to spend more time in the United Kingdom drives jobs, growth and, crucially, tax revenues. But unfortunately, the opposite is happening in the UK right now. So will the Chancellor use the spring statement to look at the statutory residence test and, in particular, the ties rules to see whether we can incentivise people to spend more time in the UK, not the other way round?
Mr. Speaker, as part of the reforms announced at the autumn budget, we are modernising the system for people from overseas spending time in the UK with a new residence-based test. We are always looking at ways to encourage people from overseas to spend time in the UK, to invest in the UK and help grow our economy.
Rachel Blake.
Speaker, I congratulate this government on the greatest level of financial sanctions that were announced last week. Does the Chancellor agree with me that keeping dirty money out of the City of London and from homes and communities across our country is vital for our national security as well as our economic stability?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and it's absolutely right that we did increase and step up the sanctions last week. Also that the loan agreement that we made with Ukraine last week, the loan will be repaid by the profits on the frozen sovereign Russian assets. Russia should pay for the damage that they have done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents is one of hundreds of people who suffered from the collapse of collateral. While the FCA has apologised to investors for failing to act faster to stop its fraudulent activities, I'm concerned that without internal changes, the FCA will make similar mistakes again. Shouldn't there be an investigation into the FCA's handling of this case?
Hear, hear. I thank the honourable lady for that question. I'm very happy to meet with her and look at the case that she mentioned because I need to get more detail.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Transport Committee has looked at the economic growth case for Heathrow expansion, and we heard conflicting evidence on the project's growth impact on regions away from London and the South East, and also on other carbon-using sectors. So will the Chancellor ask Heathrow Airport to release the full text of the Frontier Economics report on which she made her decision to expand Heathrow?
We believe, Mr. Speaker, that Heathrow as an important hub airport will have benefits for regions across the country, which Chambers of Commerce have said to us. Of course, I understand the Transport Select Committee is looking at this issue and will consider their report when they publish it in due course.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St Ralph's Hospice in my constituency faces a £140,000 increase in staff costs due to the government's national insurance hike. This means the hospice will have to further cut staff services that take the pressure off the NHS. Will the Chancellor think again and provide an exemption for healthcare providers from the national insurance cost rise?
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor set out a budget and I've set out during the finance bill and related legislation exactly how we will implement the changes announced at budget. In terms of employer national insurance contributions, there are defined ways in which public sector organisations are reimbursed. They don't apply to hospices as they are largely charities or not part of the public sector directly. However, I would point him to the £100 million of extra investment which we've announced going into improving hospices.
Dr. Alison-Gunn.
Will the Minister agree with me that investment in the 5500 Midlands Growth Corridor will provide an excellent opportunity to deliver this Labour government's mission for growth and opportunity for all?
I joined my honourable friend in celebrating investment into her region. Our growth mission is one where each part of the country will benefit, and we look forward to doing further work with her.
Jim Allister.
Again protesting in Westminster today. Why is the Chancellor of the Exchequer running away from meeting the farming unions from across this nation? Why do those who feed our nation not deserve some of the Chancellor's time?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, just 2 weeks ago, I spent a fair amount of time meeting with representatives from the NFU and other representative organisations from different nations within the UK. I listened to their concerns. I listened to what they had to say. We have to be honest that we disagree. They do not agree with the government's policy, and I need to be direct about that because we had to take a number of difficult decisions at the budget, but I do not apologise for the importance of balancing the public finances and sticking to our fiscal rules.
Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next month sees a rise and an extension to the minimum wage. In Ports of North, there are 9,600 minimum wage workers, higher than the national average, leaving many in-work poverty and many with desperate need of a boost of living standards. What steps is the government taking to help improve living standards for these low-paid workers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Member is absolutely right that a higher minimum wage is an important way that we make low-earning workers' lives better, as is the extension we announced to sick pay yesterday, which I hope will be welcomed on all sides of this House.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The art of taxation is extracting the largest amount of money with the lowest amount of squeaking from the goose. And yet the Chancellor will have heard the honking of the tractors on Whitehall today to raise an amount of money which will only pay for less than 1 day of NHS spending. So will she commit today to reversing the family farm tax?
Mr. Speaker, as we've debated several times in this chamber and indeed in Westminster Hall, the changes we've made to agricultural property relief and business property relief retain a generous relief for people who are accessing that benefit within the taxation system. It means that people will get any inheritance tax being due. That is in addition to the existing nil rate band spousal transfers. Over that is up to an effective rate of 20%, and any money which is due can be paid over 10 years interest-free.
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's recent £100 million investment into hospices, including St Michael's Hospice in Basingstoke, will help modernise facilities, enhance digital services and provide more comfortable spaces for patients and their families. Given their vital role that hospices play within all of our communities, will the Treasury continue to work with the Department of Health to ensure the sector's long-term financial stability?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question about hospices, and as he rightly points out, £100 million is being made available for hospices, £25 million in 24-25 and £75 million from April 2025. This capital funding is intended to help charitable hospices to improve and modernise their facilities and physical estate in my honourable friend's constituency and elsewhere across the country.
Tim Parham.
Speaker, Britain is only 55% food secure. In these deeply uncertain times internationally, isn't it time to change policy when it comes to agriculture? Isn't this the day to get rid of the family farm tax and to undo the 76% cut in basic payments and invest in the people who keep us food secure?
Mr. Speaker, as I've made clear to other honourable members, the changes to agricultural property relief are a fair way to raise money which is necessary to balance the public finances. Britain has excellent food security, and that is a priority for this government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's right that the government has put more money into defence. In answer, though, to a previous question this morning, the Chief Secretary said that there is an impact assessment of the overseas development budget. Does this mean this is still in scope in the spending review and there could be changes in that budget in June?
Just to clarify, Mr. Speaker, I didn't say an impact assessment. I said the impact of the changes are being considered by the government, but we will set out the detail on that in due course.
Right, final question, Rishi Sunak.
Can I commend the government on its international leadership at this challenging time? Events overnight make it even clearer that Europe must find considerably more resources for Ukraine. Now, the Chancellor has rightly continued our policy of using the interest on frozen Russian state assets to benefit Ukraine, but I believe that now is the moment to go further and to actually seize those assets. Russia's invasion of Ukraine violates the principle of sovereign equality, providing a basis in international law for this, and by acting in concert with our allies, we can ensure that there are no risks to financial stability. So can I urge the Chancellor to push for coordinated action to seize those frozen Russian state assets, give that money to the Ukrainians so that they can defend their country and rebuild it too?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the right honourable gentleman for his words about this government stepping up the funding for defence. Last week we expanded sanctions on Russia, including looking at financial services. This week we've both signed off a UKEF package to provide more military support above and beyond our defence spending, as well as that loan repaid by the profits on those assets. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, we would look at going further, but as the right honourable gentleman knows, it is incredibly complicated to do that in line with international law, but we keep all options on the table because the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Russia should pay for the damage that Russia has caused.
Right, that completes questions. Let the front bench change over. We now come to the urgent question. Ellie Jones.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, the Israeli government took the decision to block the entry of humanitarian...
Yeah, just ask the question, and then we'll come back.
I'm so sorry. To ask the Minister if she will make a statement on the situation in Gaza.
Minister.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We urge all parties to fully implement the ceasefire to help deliver a permanent end to hostilities. We're very concerned at reports that Israel is preventing humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. Israel must not block aid into Gaza. Humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. We urge the government of Israel to lift restrictions immediately and unconditionally. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire, and a halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza risks breaching Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law. The UK is doing all we can to support this. Alongside our existing support, on 28th of January, the then Minister for Development announced a further £17 million in funding to ensure healthcare, food and shelter reaches tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories and neighbouring countries. We must all work together with the United Nations and all partners to continue to facilitate aid and ensure it is sustained. Fully reinstating commercial deliveries will be key, as will allowing more types of goods in, so that civilians who lost their homes can be protected and civilian infrastructure repaired. We welcome the announcement of an agreement to end the fighting in Gaza, and we welcome the release of 38 hostages in Gaza so far, including British national Emily Damari and Eli Sharabi, who both have close links to the UK, Emily, of course, having met the Prime Minister and discussed the dreadful treatment at the hands of Hamas. The hostages and their families have endured unimaginable suffering from the cruelty of Hamas, and the situation in Gaza has continued to worsen. The current ceasefire is the only way for the region to move forward. As we've made clear, we want to see a negotiated two-state solution with a sovereign Palestinian state, including the West Bank and Gaza, alongside a safe and secure Israel. We've also made clear that we would oppose any effort to move Palestinians in Gaza to neighbouring Arab states against their will. Forced displacements of Palestinians or any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip are simply not an option. We need Palestinian civilians to be able to return to their homes and lives and to rebuild. International law guarantees them this right. A two-state solution is the only way to secure long-term peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Mr. Speaker, as the Foreign Secretary said, you can hold in your heart the pain of the Israeli people and the plight of those hostages and their families, and at the same time you can hold in your heart the awful damage, pain and suffering that this has wrought in Gaza, with well over 45,000 Palestinian people having lost their lives. We must continue to focus on the future, on turning the current ceasefire deal into a political process which leads to the two-state solution, including the West Bank and Gaza.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, the Israeli government took the decision to block the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. The Minister talked about that aid, but it can no longer be delivered. It is once again using starvation as a weapon of war. And today we hear that it has also announced a so-called hell plan that would see electricity and remaining water supplies cut off. These decisions coincide with the end of the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, with negotiations on phase 2 barely begun, jeopardising the release of the remaining live hostages, plans for a withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and a longer-term peace agreement. The UN have said international humanitarian law is clear. We must be allowed access to deliver vital, life-saving aid. Oxfam describes the move, made as Ramadan began, as a reckless act of collective punishment, explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law. And the International Court of Justice has previously issued explicit instructions to Israel to facilitate aid deliveries to Gaza. Does the Minister agree that the Israeli government is again in clear violation of the ceasefire agreement and of international humanitarian law? Can she confirm whether she or her colleagues have spoken to their Israeli counterparts to condemn its hell plan and to make clear that there must be no resumption of the war and that it is unacceptable for the people of Gaza to be denied critical food, water, medical or any other supplies? Can she tell us what action the UK will be taking against the Israeli government if it continues to illegally use humanitarian aid and access to water and power as a bargaining chip? I know she wants the ceasefire to hold. Can the Minister share her assessment of the impact of these latest developments on the prospects for a lasting, just and fair peace? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the urgent question. A halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza, such as that announced by the Government of Israel, does risk breaching obligations under international humanitarian law. And to answer her question directly, the UK government has been in touch with interlocutors to make that point. In fact, my colleague, the member for Lincoln, is in the region currently, pushing for the peace deal, and hence myself as the Indo-Pacific Minister having to cross this brief today in the House. Humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. On the 28th of January, the then Minister for Development announced £17 million in funding to ensure healthcare, food and shelter could reach tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories. The UK has announced £129 million funding for the OPTs so far this financial year, including £41 million for UNRWA. She has asked about the long-term ceasefire prospects, and the UK plays its part in pushing both sides towards a hopeful future for the region, working not just with Arab states, but also with partners such as the US to try and push for a solution which is in line with international humanitarian law.
Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I've just come back from the Middle East, where we went with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And whilst the world watches with increasing alarm the disintegration of the peace process in Gaza, we were warned in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in the West Bank and in Israel that the far-right government in Israel may have no long-term plan when it comes to Gaza, but there is a long-term plan when it comes to the West Bank, and that is annexation. The international community is well aware of this. They see the evictions, they see the demolitions, they see the increasing numbers of Israeli settlements and the 40,000 people who have recently been displaced. In these days of hard power, what is Plan B? What is the international community going to do to stop the annexation of the West Bank? Because it won't be enough to simply condemn it once it's happened.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee and for her ongoing interest in this important matter of foreign policy, and for the work that she and her committee have done to do personal interviews and personal visits to the region. And this is all part of the supportive role which the UK must play and must take an international role in pushing for peace. On the specific question of the West Bank, the UK government has taken a very tough position on attacks by some of the militant factions or groups who are attacking Palestinians in the occupied territories in the West Bank. And we are continuing to look at measures which are available to get our message across, not just in words, but in actions. And with her permission, I will write to her as the Chair of the Select Committee to give an update on our current position in terms of our assessment of that situation.
Senator Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Speaker, as recent days have shown, the ceasefire continues to be incredibly fragile, and of course we all want this agreement to hold. And none of us should be in any doubt that this hinges upon the release of each and every single hostage held by Iranian-backed terrorists, Hamas, who caused the conflict by their sickening acts on the 7th of October. Those hostages, as the Minister has pointed out, and their families have now suffered unimaginably for over 500 days, and this cannot go on. They've been held in barbaric conditions, and the world has been shocked by the distressing scenes surrounding those who have been released. And the Minister rightly refers to Emily Damari and others. And in Emily's case, she has shared the really awful nature of the ordeal that she experienced in Hamas captivity. And we wish her all well in her recent medical appointments that she's now receiving in the treatment. Mr. Speaker, last week we also tragically saw the distressing return of bodies of those killed under Hamas captivity. And our hearts break for their loved ones, and we mourn them and also the people of Israel. I have a series of questions for the Minister, Mr. Speaker. First of all, what role is the UK playing in helping to get an agreement on phase 2 of this ceasefire over the line? What discussions has the Foreign Secretary had with America, Israel and other regional players in recent days? What engagement has the government had in relation to the plans for the future of Gaza that have been discussed in Cairo, and how to prevent Hamas continuing to control the Gaza Strip? Secondly, what is the government's practical response on aid access? How is the government working to unblock this situation? And what is happening to the British aid that is already in the region or en route? Finally, what recent conversations has the Foreign Affairs Ministers, the Foreign Office Ministers, had with the International Committee of the Red Cross, both on their efforts on hostage release and also on humanitarian assistance more broadly?
Minister.
I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for her emphasising of the families on both sides of this terrible conflict, but particularly the British families, of course, who the Prime Minister has met, particularly Emily Damari, the dignity and grace of the families, of all who want a home, of all who want security in the region, and of all who have been affected by this most horrendous of wars. And she evoked in her speech, in her remarks, the terrible images of hostages being released with the most macabre of pantomimes behind them. And this level of cruelty is utterly unacceptable. And the UK has made that very clear to interlocutors, both at ministerial level and at Foreign Secretary level. And of course, she talks about the role of phase 2. And there have been stops and starts in this peace process, as often there is in these very difficult situations. And what is our role? Our role is to continue to speak very closely with the US and Steve Witkoff in order to try and push for practical day-to-day solutions. She asks about British aid and what negotiations we are undertaking. We are in daily contact with the region, pushing for discussions, conversations, dialogue to push for that aid to get back in, and specifically the Red Cross, which is obviously one of our partner organisations. We will undertake, following this urgent question, to contact them with a message from this House that we want that aid to re-enter and to save lives.
Abdissam Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The powerful scenes of Palestinians celebrating the start of Ramadan, even as their homes and lives have been reduced to rubble by Israeli forces, sends a defiant message to the world that despite the displacement and destruction, Palestinians remain rooted in their land. Will the Minister confirm that the decision of blocking all aid into Gaza, collectively punishing the entire population, is a war crime and a breach of international law, contravening provisions of the Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute?
Minister.
She's quite right to point out the devastating impact of no aid getting through. And she's right to say that a halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza, such as that recently announced by the Government of Israel, does risk breaching its obligations under international humanitarian law. It's not for ministers at the dispatch box to make legal decisions or judgments, but I want to assure her that the former Minister for Development, the member for Oxford East, did pledge the £17 million to ensure healthcare, food and shelter reaching tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure. And she must reassure her constituents that the Foreign Office is doing all it can to get infrastructure across the OPTs and into Gaza in order to relieve the suffering.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Speaker, the Israeli government is wrong to prevent humanitarian aid entering Gaza. It threatens the lives of Gazans dependent on aid after the destruction of the last 15 months and is a clear breach of international humanitarian law. So what practical steps is the government taking to ensure that the Israeli government backs down and lets the aid in? I understand the depth of distress in Israel over the despicable way in which Hamas terrorists have played psychological games with the hostages and their families. Yet withholding essential supplies of food, medicine and shelter only worsens the devastation faced by the Palestinian people. In the West Bank, we also see illegal settlers violently attacking Palestinians and apparently receiving the support of members of the Israeli cabinet. So does the Minister agree with me that the UK must do all we can to undermine the extremists in this conflict so that a second phase of the ceasefire can be negotiated, all hostages released and Gazans receive the aid they desperately need?
Minister.
Could I thank the Lib Dem spokesperson for his words, and he's quite right to emphasise the psychological impact of this terrible conflict and the traumatised state that there is in the region. And as the Foreign Secretary has said, we welcome the release of the 38 hostages in Gaza, including, of course, Emily Damari, who we've already mentioned. And we think so much of the Lifshitz family, who, of course, had strong ties to the UK, held hostage by terrorists in Gaza and died. We thank Qatar, Egypt and the US for bringing their support to ensure that individuals and families' horrific ordeal can come to an end. But this is not the end, unfortunately, and that's why it's so important that we have this moment to push. He asks what we're doing practically. We're in daily contact with the region, including our mission there, and we're also obviously having these interventions which push in terms of the international debate for a just solution for both sides of this terrible conflict.
Alice Bellinger.
Last week I was in the West Bank alongside other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee on our wider trip to the Middle East. Whilst the world's attention is rightly on the devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza, we met Palestinians in the Jordan Valley whose schools were being attacked, whose mosques were being burned, and whose livestock was being stolen by extremist Israeli settlers. This is happening with the apparent connivance of the Israeli security forces, and it appears to be part of a wider plan for annexation. Could the Minister tell us what steps we are taking to protect further erosion of Palestinian land in the West Bank that will make the two-state solution even further away?
Minister.
I thank the member for his question and for his expertise in the area of aid and foreign affairs. And he's quite right to emphasise that the settlers and some of their actions, of course, there are many, many settler communities who just get on with it and want to see a peaceful solution. But he's quite right to say that there is violence in the settlements, which are, of course, unlawful under international humanitarian law and do harm the prospect for a two-state solution. I thank him for putting on record, particularly during the holy month of Ramadan, the impact on the faith community and mosques which have been attacked. And this is certainly a point that we will ensure gets through in our next discussion with our interlocutors, both on the Israel side, but also on the Palestinian side.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, no one is surprised that as soon as the world's attention shifted from Gaza, that Israel reimposed their siege, preventing entry of all humanitarian aid. The Minister knows the impact that this will have on the beleaguered civilian population who are already suffering disease, starvation and an absence of health care. After 17 months of giving Israel carte blanche, none of us, least of all Netanyahu, expects there to be any meaningful consequence for their actions. But could she tell me, does she consider what's happening in Gaza now to be a collective punishment? And if she doesn't, what would she call it?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think sometimes the words that we use are really important, and there has been an enormous amount of suffering. And we know that for so many in Israel, they feel we don't understand their need for security. And so many in Gaza feel we don't understand the depth of their suffering. So we must redouble our efforts to communicate what we want to see, which is that two-state solution and that peaceful future for both of these communities, which must live side by side.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The leaders of the Arab world have made welcome proposals
about the future of Gaza and its people. What update can the Minister give on the UK's support for those proposals? And will she join with me in particularly welcoming those proposals that they recognise that the terrorist death cult Hamas can have no future in the future governance of Gaza?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's quite right to say that as a proscribed terror organisation, Hamas has certainly displayed some very frightening characteristics of what we would expect a terrorist organisation to do, including the macabre pantomime which we saw over the last couple of weeks with the release of hostages, which is truly shocking. And I thank him for his question, and obviously the exact detail on the next stage of the negotiation is to be defined by the two parties, but we play a real role both with the ally, which is Israel, but also with working with Egypt and Qatar, and also with the wider region, which is why our minister right now is in the region making the point that we want to be involved, we want to be pushing for a peaceful solution, and to see that day when neither terrorism is extant and where the two communities can live side by side in peace.
Kit Maltos.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to ask a question about what we were going to do if the Israelis refused to let in aid or turn on the water and power, but I think we all know basically the answer is nothing. So instead, let me ask this. The Minister quite rightly mentioned the macabre display around the return of the hostages and the condition of those hostages being returned. And she's right. She said she's taken this up with interlocutors, I think she said. But why hasn't she mentioned the return of the Palestinian non-combatants? Why hasn't she mentioned their condition when they're returning often emaciated and with signs of torture? Why hasn't she mentioned the number of senior medics who've been detained without charge and then died in mysterious circumstances in Israeli detention? Apparently there being some kind of investigation which never comes to a conclusion. And is she surprised that people have become cynical about British conduct in this conflict, when it seems that we're only concerned about the welfare of one side?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, I think we've had a very balanced approach across this House to the suffering of all the communities based in the region. And I think he is right to mention the terrible suffering of those who have experienced either arbitrary detention or who have experienced allegations of torture by various enforcement agencies. And he's also right to include this in what needs to be the next step of the negotiation around the one side of the hostages, but also those who are being released from prison. But could I also remind him that there are concerns that there might be people who shouldn't have been released, who are being released. And so all of that has to be taken in the round and balanced. And I do encourage balance and understanding about the suffering of both sides of the community and the desire for security, in the words that we use in the House.
Detainee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue of collaboration, infiltration between Hamas and some UNRWA officials is well documented. Now, clearly, people in Gaza need aid. So can the Minister update us on how we are monitoring the work being done to restore neutrality and confidence in UNRWA?
Minister.
The UK government has been a supporter of the work of UNRWA throughout this conflict and before it, and has been supporting UNRWA financially, as have all international organisations and countries. And of course, there have been problems with certain challenges to individuals who have been employed by UNRWA, but we have consistently joined with allies in expressing our concerns about the role of UNRWA being curtailed. And we urged at the UN Security Council on the 6th of November, the 11th of December, the 3rd of January, the 28th of January, the 25th of February, and in a joint statement with partners on the 27th of October, that we were urging that the important work of UNRWA can continue.
Shocker Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The blockade of aid is just in the last line of a long-term activities that Israelis have committed against the Palestinian people. But what I would like to ask the Minister is this, that now that we have cut overseas aid to a mere 0.3% of GDP, which is the lowest in real terms in 20 years, does she still agree with the Labour Party manifesto that international aid makes the world a safer and more prosperous place? And now does she agree that with this move, the UK's historic role in the Middle East is dead and over?
Minister.
He's quite right to talk about the ongoing need for aid in the region, and the Prime Minister was very careful in his speech, both at the end of last week, and I think he's mentioned it as well since then on the press, that humanitarian aid must continue, and Gaza was specifically mentioned because it is one of our top priorities, and he's aware that the decision is only a week old to divert some of our aid spending into the defence of Europe, but he must also be aware that we will come forward with the detail of that. But could I reassure him and his constituents that Gaza was specifically mentioned in this House by the Prime Minister because it remains one of our top priorities within the Foreign Office.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that Israel has been emboldened by Trumpian tactics in imposing a total siege and blocking all supplies, including humanitarian aid into Gaza, to force new ceasefire terms. So we should be clear and call it what it is in this House: collective punishment of the Palestinian people, starvation as a method of war, and a blatant war crime. So will the Minister finally sanction Israel for these gross violations of international law?
Hear, hear, hear. Minister.
Well, specifically on the question of sanctions, I think he knows what I'm going to say, which is we don't talk about them until we actually make a decision, and we do review any tools that we have available to us to protest. But I think we also need to understand that we're in the midst of a peace process, and we know that peace processes throughout history have stop-start elements to them. But what we are doing is we are making sure that our views, the views of this House, the view of the government, is that we must we must make sure that humanitarian aid is not prevented from entering Gaza. While this important peace process is going on, people still need to eat, they still need to have life-saving medical treatment, children still need to be educated, and that is the point that we've continued to make all the way along.
Caroline Bowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In her letter resigning as International Development Minister last week, the Right Honourable Member for Oxford East wrote that it will be impossible, given this cut's depth, to maintain the government's support for all its development commitments, and explicitly cited aid to Gaza. And at this point, I would just like to commend the Totnes Friends of Palestine for raising now £10,000 to help those in Gaza. With hospitals destroyed, a lack of clean water, desperate food shortages and now more threats to power and water supplies, how will the Minister ensure that last week's cut to development spending will not worsen the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in Gaza?
Minister.
Well, could I congratulate her for all the work that she does in her community to support international support and solidarity for communities in Gaza. And we know that the humanitarian situation remains extremely challenging, with over 48,000 having been killed and 90% of the population have been displaced, many repeatedly. But I think the UK has a really good story to tell. We've been in there for for decades now, and we've increased that. She mentions the outgoing Minister for Development, and of course there was a further £17 million announced on the 28th of January, so that healthcare, food and shelter could reach tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure. She asks about ongoing funding, and she's right to ask that question and hold our feet to the fire. And once we've had time to look at the coming financial years and the comprehensive spending review, she will have her answer.
Hasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that Israel's decision to block aid to over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza is collective punishment, and with 80% of Gaza's health infrastructure destroyed, 1,000 medical workers killed, and the WHO estimating that 14,000 Palestinians, including 4,500 children, require urgent medical evacuation. What concrete steps have we taken to ensure that A, aid gets in, and B, those that need medical treatment have that treatment made available to them?
I thank the member for Bolton for her question and for her ongoing campaigning on humanitarian aid for Gaza. And of course, it's very positive that the Rafah crossing remains open, enabling a significant increase in the number of medical evacuations in recent weeks. It's vital that Israel ensures that there is a sustained passage for patients who need treatment not available in Gaza. Officials from across all relevant Whitehall departments are exploring avenues to ensure our support best meets the needs of the critically ill in Gaza. And the member previously on the other benches did talk about the medical staff who are under threat, and we have supported with technical advice and training, and also we announced £1 million for the Egyptian Ministry of Health and Population, delivered through the WHO Egypt, to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Israel All-Party Group heard from the families of 5 of the remaining hostages. Of the 59 hostages still in captivity, it's estimated that only 24 are alive and 35 have been murdered. The reality is that the recently released Eli Sharabai described the conditions he was held in chains, brutally beaten and starved. The reality is that Alon Ohen, who is also alongside him, remains in captivity. The families believe that there is a very vulnerable position for all those remaining hostages. So clearly the demand has to be for all of the hostages to be released immediately, and that should be the aim of the British government. What action is the Minister taking to make sure that that happens?
Minister.
I thank the member for his question about the hostages and his ongoing support for peace in the region. And we know that the families who, of course, have the UK connection, and he specifically mentioned Ellie's family, Ellie Sharabi. The UK has played an active role in coordinating with international partners since the beginning of the conflict. The Foreign Secretary has visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories on 3 occasions since taking office, and has worked closely with European partners to push for a resolution to secure the ceasefire. And I have to say, I do think the situation has improved on that front in the last couple of weeks. But he's right to emphasise the return of hostages as part of that negotiated next part of the peace process. And I thank him for his question.
Frank McNally.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for updating the House on this troubling matter. This decision by the Israeli government is contrary to international humanitarian law and clearly undermines such a fragile ceasefire. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have been absolutely clear of the right of Palestinians to return home to Gaza to rebuild their lives. So does the Minister agree with me that that right is jeopardised by the blocking of critical humanitarian aid? And what actions will the government take if that right continues to be restricted?
He's quite right to say that humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. And we urge the government of Israel to lift restrictions immediately and unconditionally. And he asks what else this government will do. We will continue to support the peace process, to support both sides getting around the table, freeing the hostages, allowing the aid in, and having a vision for the future of this region, which is so affected by conflict and death.
Lamran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I pay tribute to the former International Development Secretary, my constituency neighbour, the Right Honourable Member for Oxford East, for her work in this area and also the wise words in her resignation letter. The Minister rightly said that forced displacement is unacceptable. Indeed, I think she mentioned that the actions of the illegal extremist settlers are unlawful. You may have seen, Mr. Speaker, at the Oscars this week, an incredible film called No Other Land, made by both Israelis and Palestinians together, highlighting the forced displacements in Masafer Yatta, won the Oscar. Now, I bet they would trade every gong going for that film to have its desired effect and for the violence to stop. We can do something. And if there was ever a time for us to ban illegal settlement goods that funds these extremist settlers, is now not the time?
Minister.
Could I thank the Honourable Lady for all of her work in the community and also in this House, educating members about not just the two sides that we always think about, but also the Christian community in Gaza as well, and in Palestine, Palestinians, Christians, who are also affected so much by the current conflict. She mentions the UK's position on settlements, and I wanted to be clear that the UK's position on settlements is they're illegal under international law, present an obstacle to peace, and threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution.
Session Lobby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many members have spoken about the importance of humanitarian aid, that vital aid to save so many lives. But what's also important are the vital aid workers who are working on the ground in really horrific conditions. Estimates show that over 320 aid workers have been killed, the highest ever on record. And yet we see so many different aid organisations being attacked on social media, saying they have links to terrorist organisations. What more can the Minister do to outline and reiterate this government's support for vital international aid organisations, including Islamic Relief, based in my constituency, who are only one of the UK's 5 NGOs certified by the core humanitarian standards, meaning they go through the most rigorous standards on their aid and transparency? What more can we do to support these vital aid workers?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her important work in this area and for the aid organisations which are based locally just across the river. And it is true to say that aid must get to those who need it across all areas, but that the important work of aid workers must be respected and aid workers must be protected. And it's horrifying to hear reports, for example, that 6 babies have died from hypothermia and cold-related injuries in Gaza in just 2 weeks. And this is why aid organisations such as Islamic Aid, but the Red Cross and all the other organisations who make up the partnerships across the region must be able to get in to Gaza to do their important work, and also must be allowed to bring in the types of goods such as tents, medical equipment and machinery needed to support the resumption of basic services in Gaza.
Jim Shamble.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for the answers to the UQ. The PM was very clear in the Chamber yesterday in his support for Ukraine until peace is achieved over the weekend, for which I am eternally grateful. But will the Minister confirm that our support remains with Israel as we attempt to secure peace for now and a lasting solution to maintain? And we hope that a future for the children on both sides of that Gaza boundary can be achieved. Thank you so much.
Minister.
I thank the honourable member for mentioning the children in this conflict, and he's very well aware of the trauma that can be passed down from generation to generation as a result, and also thinking of orphans in the region, of which there are many. And I thank him for his commitment to the State of Israel, as he says, and to a secure future for the people of Israel, so that the people of Israel can have that security which they seek, but that also an end can come to that of the suffering of people in Palestine as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In addition to my sadness and alarm about the Netanyahu government again blocking aid from entering into Gaza, I have repeatedly raised my concerns in Parliament over the years about the forced evictions and illegal settlements in the West Bank. And now, shockingly, for the first time in 2 decades, there are tanks in Jenin and further displacement of Palestinians. So, Minister, what representations is the government making to the Israeli government that aid must not be blocked from entering Gaza, and that this illegal occupation and further evictions must immediately be stopped?
Minister.
It gives me a further opportunity to emphasise that settlements, Israeli settlements, are illegal under international law and do harm prospects for a two-state solution. The Foreign Secretary has made it clear on a number of occasions with Israeli ministers that the government must clamp down on settler violence and end settler expansion.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for mentioning orphans, because unfortunately orphans don't have too much a voice in this place, but I'm grateful for doing so, and sadly there are too many across the world who see more and more conflict. Can I agree with my right honourable friend, the member for North West Hampshire, that civilian lives, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian, are just as precious? We should do all we can across the House to save life. But can I ask, I mean, I do have concerns. It may be a surprise, Mr. Speaker, that Ukraine may not be the biggest foreign policy headache for the government over the next coming months. And I think it may well be Israel and the divergence on Israel with the new American administration. That is a great concern. So does she accept what has been agreed in Cairo today at the Cairo Arab Summit, $53 billion 5-year reconstruction plan for Gaza, which allows displaced Palestinians to return, that we don't see a Trump Gaza Riviera, and it is countries in the region putting Palestinians back into Gaza at the heart of the future of Gaza?
Minister.
I thank the member for his question with the many aspects in it. And of course, he's aware that the majority of all homes in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. And the economy has collapsed, and delivery of basic services, including energy and water, have been badly affected. Over 60% of the electricity distribution network has been damaged or destroyed. Over 90% of main roads are damaged, profoundly limiting mobility of people, aid and goods. And that's why it's so welcome that the $53.2 billion has been underlined. And we are supportive of the regional efforts to cohere around a single, workable reconstruction plan for Gaza. And we support the region with their expertise in construction in the region to get going on that. And if I could briefly answer his question as well about the orphans. He's aware perhaps that the Foreign Secretary has as one of his main areas of concern the welfare of children, particularly children who are orphans or in need of adoption or fostering. And I will take back to him today his concern, particularly for that work stream that we do quite a lot on in the Foreign Office, and emphasise its importance.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The suffering of Palestinian children who have been attacked by Israeli drones is devastating. Yeah. And the fact that those children are denied medical support and assistance is even more devastating. Yeah. The Minister's talked about how we're looking at medical evacuations, but would the Minister agree with me? Actions speak louder than words. And when will enough be enough? And when will these children get the attention that they so desperately need when other countries are doing the same right now? Yeah.
She's quite right to talk about the children, and we know whether it's in Sudan, whether it is in Ukraine and everywhere else, that children suffer that deep trauma as a result of conflict. And we're deeply alarmed by the disproportionate impact of the conflict on children in Gaza. Half of Gaza's population, of course, are children, and the consequences of tens of thousands killed, injured or separated from parents threaten not only their individual futures, but the very fabric of Palestinian society for generations to come. Most, if not all, students in Gaza have not had access to education since the 7th of October, and at least 88% of school buildings will need full or major reconstruction. So she's quite right to say, what are we doing? And the UK is supporting the restoration of education services in Gaza, including through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. And she would be aware as well of the important work to keep going to maintain the ceasefire that we've got so that we have a hope of that reconstruction dream.
Ben Lake.
I'm very pleased to hear the Minister emphasise that the withholding of humanitarian aid is a direct contravention of humanitarian international law. I would also like to ask her what steps her government is taking to work with partners both in the region and in Europe to apply pressure to the Israeli government to ensure that the flow of such critical aid is no longer impeded.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and that is precisely why we have ministerial visits to the region, and in order to emphasise the importance that it is, not just to the government, but to this House, that we take a message to keep pushing for that peaceful future and to keep pushing for the importance of, in the meantime, today, enough food to eat, enough water to wash and to cook, and of course to educate and to keep people healthy and safe.
Tricia Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask my honourable friend if the government has carried out an assessment of the impact of the withdrawal of US aid from the region, and in light of any assessment that may have been carried out, is the government confident that the decision to cut international aid from our budget will not be an increasingly detrimental problem in Gaza? I understand that the Prime Minister has said that Gaza is ring-fenced, if you like, and that our humanitarian aid there will continue, but I am concerned that the withdrawal of American aid may leave a vacuum that we cannot fill.
Minister.
Could I thank her for her question? And it is true to say that over the decades, the US people, the people of the USA have been so generous across the world in aid, including in this region. And so it's going to be almost impossible to replace the important work that USAID has done over the decades in the Middle East. However, I do not give up hope, because I think we have to keep making the case for working together internationally. A lot of the work that is done in the region is by partners working multilaterally, and so it's, yes, a part of USAID, but it's also trying to encourage other countries and countries in the region which perhaps do have more vibrant economies to step up to the plate now and to fill those gaps. Her specific question about the assessment, it's not complete because the decision is still relatively recent, as is our own decision of under a week ago. But I trust that we will come back to the House when we have more of a shape of the comprehensive spending review and how we are going to address this difficult problem.
Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the London School of Economics Middle East Centre will host the launch of a book called Understanding Hamas. One contributor to the book, Azam Tamimi, has previously called for the destruction of the State of Israel. Speakers at the event deny Hamas as a terrorist organisation and dismiss Israel wrongly as a white settler colonialist nation. Can the Minister join me in saying very clearly this is not an accurate description of Israel? There is no genocide, as unfortunately I heard a member claim earlier, and Hamas is a terrorist organisation that seeks to murder Jews and has brought nothing but destruction and disaster to the people of Gaza.
Minister.
Well, I thank him for doing his research before coming to the House, and I can confirm that Hamas is a proscribed terror organisation by our government for those very reasons. And I think it is really important that we are very robust in our defence of the right of the State of Israel to exist as our allies.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of both Israel and Palestine have been failed by their leadership with horrific consequences. One person who knew that more than most was my constituent's father, Oded Lifshitz, whose coffin we saw paraded horrifically through the streets of Khan Yunis. Oded, we should say his name in this place because he dedicated his life to securing peace between Israel and Palestine. He drove ambulances over the border to help Palestinian people. We can be clear in this chamber that withholding aid is wrong, using starvation as a weapon of war is wrong, but if we want to challenge their leadership, we must step up ourselves. The Minister spoke previously about what we are doing to try and support medical needs in Gaza. Can she be clear, for the avoidance of doubt, in his memory may it be a blessing, in his cause we will follow up, that we will evacuate people who need it to the UK for medical assistance from Gaza?
I thank my honourable friend, and the family have a great champion in her coming to the House and laying out in such clear terms her expectation of the government. And there have been certain schemes to assist families in medical emergencies, and with her permission I will write to her with the exact detail and the exact guidelines which are used by the government to determine who's eligible for those schemes.
Jeremy Corbyn. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are now 60,000 known deaths in Gaza. Israel is already accused by the ICJ and ICC of war crimes and including genocidal acts, and they're now committing a new war crime in denial of food and water to the people of Gaza. What will it take for the British government to cease all arms supplies to Israel, to end the use of the RAF bases in Akrotiri as a staging point for delivery to Israel? And when will we end the security cooperation with Israel to make it absolutely clear that we're not prepared to support a regime which is breaking international humanitarian law in so many respects?
Minister.
As the member is aware, as soon as the Foreign Secretary took office, he ordered a review into the compliance with international humanitarian law of various export items. And following the review, the government suspended export licences to Israel under a number of categories and assessed that where there was a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. On the question of genocide, as he is aware, it's not a question for the Minister to determine at the dispatch box, but of course legal experts continue to look at definitions and descriptions of acts of war and will come forward with their determinations over time.
I'm planning to run this urgent question for only about another 10 minutes, so it would be very helpful if questions could be short, please. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over recent days, we have seen the power of addressing the most challenging diplomatic, military and humanitarian crisis when coordinated action is brought together. And yet in 17 months, we have not seen a parallel when addressing the challenges over Gaza. So what action is her department taking to ensure that there is that coordinated effort? And will the Foreign Secretary call such a summit?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that suggestion, and certainly the UK will continue to work, as it has done, ceaselessly with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the US and regional partners to build consensus for a post-conflict Gaza governance and security framework which supports conditions for a permanent and sustainable peace. And her request has been heard in the Chamber.
Monica Harding.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Minister what message does she think the government gives about its commitment to international aid in Gaza and indeed anywhere else in not only cutting it to 0.3%, its lowest level this century, but in removing the ability for this House to scrutinise that cut or any remaining spend by moving ministerial responsibility for aid and development from here to the other place?
Minister.
I thank her for her question, and there will be an opportunity later this week at the estimates debate for her to ask further questions. But as I'm sure she's aware, with her expertise in aid and development and in soft power, that it will take some time for the comprehensive spending review to come forward with a picture of how this will look in terms of resource implications. But I know also that she and her party do support in fundamentally the decision to look at the security of Europe as well and try and make that a part of the balance in our foreign policy work.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I understand that the Minister doesn't want to give a legal opinion, but isn't it clear that banning all supplies from Gaza is a breach of the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute? A failure to call that out emboldens Israel in its collective punishment of all Gazans. And will she confirm, as it was missing from her earlier statement, that when the government finally recognises the Palestinian state, it will include not only the West Bank and Gaza, but East Jerusalem as its capital?
I thank my honourable friend for all of his work as the chair of the all-party group and also for his ongoing campaigning in this area. To be clear, humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. And of course, East Jerusalem should be the shared capital.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents are horrified at reports that the UK government is not only complicit in Israeli atrocities, but has actively and directly participated in the war crimes and ethnic cleansing perpetrated by Israel. So will the Minister explain to this House what the UK's participation and role has been in the Israeli genocide, and the ongoing atrocities that continue in Gaza and the West Bank?
I thank the honourable member for his question, and as I've mentioned before, it's not for the Minister to determine the definition of genocide, but it is for legal experts. But in terms of the role of the UK, the reason that I, as the Indo-Pacific Minister, am here before you today is because our Middle East Minister, the member for Lincoln, is currently engaging in conversations and pushing for a peaceful solution. And there can be no better thing than a face-to-face meeting with a Minister of His Majesty's government in the region, having those important discussions and pushing for peace.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With almost 20,000 Palestinian children killed, Gaza and its people are in a state of devastation. The use of starvation as a weapon of war is a war crime. The denial of humanitarian aid is a war crime and leads to babies freezing to death, an example the Minister gave earlier. What specific action is the government taking with allies to pressure the Israeli government to comply with international law and let aid into Gaza?
I thank the honourable member and for all of her work she did before she entered this Parliament on aid and on supporting international solutions for war-affected areas. And specifically, our work does continue with partners, be that Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the US, and regional partners, to build that consensus, because we all want to live in a world where aid is no longer necessary, where there's a vibrant economy, where people have jobs, schools, and hospitals. And that's what the UK is doing, redoubling our efforts for post-conflict Gaza governance security framework that supports conditions for a permanent and sustainable peace.
Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must admit it's been very frustrating today to hear the practical inaction from this government in the face of flagrant breaches of international law with the siege of Gaza, and I sincerely hope the government doesn't continue down this path of inertia. With that in mind, what steps is the Minister taking to immediately recognise Palestine as a state, as part of the two-state solution based on the 67 borders? This is surely essential to reinvigorate the peace process and deter those extremists seeking perpetual conflict in Gaza, the West Bank, and across the Middle East.
He's quite right to describe what feels like a hopeless situation, but I would just remind him that, over the last few weeks we've seen some rays of sunlight, a few bits of hope, as hopefully less violence is being perpetrated and more people are coming back to their homes. However, he's right to push the government and to say what more can be done, and that does include those visits to the region to speak to those interlocutors I've mentioned and to keep pushing for peace.
Steve Yem.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of course, many of us in this House want to see progress towards a permanent two-state solution after the current ceasefire and hostage deal. And in December, the Prime Minister announced that the Foreign Secretary will be convening a meeting of partners to support civil society, both in Israel and Palestine. I wonder what update the Minister can provide the House on how the UK will plan to support the International Fund for Israeli-Palestine Peace.
Minister.
I thank the member for his question, and of course in the short term, Israeli military withdrawal from Gaza will be phased. All parties have agreed to this, but in time we must see the occupation end as confidence is rebuilt in Gaza and Israel. The Palestinian Authority should play a key role in the future governance and security of Gaza, and for the deal to work, we need all parties to cooperate, including to make future security arrangements which protect both Israelis and Palestinians and allow the safe distribution of aid in the vision of the two-state solution.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite the appalling abuse of hostages who were released and the propaganda value which was made of them, the Israeli government in 42 days has allowed 25,200 truckloads of aid into Gaza, enough to sustain the entire population for 4 months. The concern is this, it's a fact. The concern is this, that Hamas are now using aid as their major source of income, seeking to control the billion-dollar aid industry which is now in Gaza. What assurances can the Minister give that UK aid will not be used to sustain the terrorist organisation or to control a local population.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And he needs to be careful if he's reading online things that they are correct, because while there has been recent arrivals of aid, we all know that aid is a continuing thing. We all want to eat fresh food. We all need fresh medications. We all need to have water and all of those other things which the essential aid which is coming in needs to be refreshed every day. And I think what we can say in this House is that providing access to essential civilian services is also crucial with that aid. And so I do encourage him to widen his sources of what he's reading about the access of aid into the Gaza and the West Bank.
Rupa Huck.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Instituting an aid blockade while getting on for 50,000 Gazans have been killed and there is a polio epidemic surely looks like deprivations to civilians are being used as a weapon of war. So what are our government doing about this and to ensure that the entire fragile ceasefire doesn't fall apart and those hostages come home?
Minister.
I thank the member for her question and for her specific question about polio, and we're very pleased to hear that the latest polio vaccination rollout reached 99% of the children who were targeted. But we remain gravely concerned by the lack of adequate medical care in a wider sense in Gaza. And all prisoners, including medical staff detained in Gaza, must be allowed full ICRC access.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker, other than her response to the excellent question from the Right Honourable Member for North West Hampshire, I strongly welcome the Minister's both tone and content to the answers to the questions today. I mean, it's quite clear there's no justification for the vindictive and counterproductive actions of the Israeli government, but they're clearly emboldened by the US President. And my question to the Minister is this: therefore seeking to build international alliances in order to put pressure on the Israeli government to change their actions and to stop this vindictive behaviour, what conversations is the government having to make sure that its view is being conveyed to the United States that they can adopt the same line as we are?
Well, I thank the member for his question, and just to clarify some of the ideas which have been coming out about the future of Gaza, for example, we have made clear that we would oppose any effort to move Palestinians in Gaza to neighbouring Arab states, which was one of the ideas which was proposed, and that forced displacements of Palestinians or any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip are simply not an option. And I thank him also for helping us to keep on track with what people in the region actually want, and to be supporting around the table all of those partners who are pushing for that peaceful deal between the two parties.
Final question, Conor Rand.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And would the Minister agree with me that especially at a time of such intense suffering for so many civilians in Gaza, that the use of both humanitarian assistance as well as aid is both totally unacceptable, but also not conducive to a lasting ceasefire and to long-term peace?
I mean, he's quite right to emphasise the need for the steady inflow of aid, and anything else could potentially be a breach of international humanitarian law. But I think what we see in peace processes is hiccups, one step forward, two steps back. And I think we would be pushing for all parties to see this as a hiccup. And I hope to wake up tomorrow morning to the happy news that all is back on track, that aid is getting in, conversations are happening, and that peaceful future that we all want to see for the two parties is becoming a reality.
And I thank the Minister for her responses. I'll allow a couple of moments for the front benches to swap over. Which brings us to the urgent question, Hong Kong democracy activist Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To ask the Home Secretary to make a statement on bounties placed on Hong Kong democracy activists in the United Kingdom by the Chinese Communist Party and other authorities in Hong Kong and China.
Mr. Dan Jarvis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question on what I agree is a very serious matter. Security is the first duty of government, and as such we are deeply concerned by the recent bounties placed on Hong Kong democracy activists resident here in the UK. As the Right Honourable Gentleman will know, the Foreign Secretary issued a statement condemning these bounties. As he said at the time, these individuals were merely exercising their right to freedom of expression. As the Foreign Secretary has also said, we call on Beijing to repeal the national security law, including its extraterritorial reach. We also call on the Hong Kong authorities to end their targeting of individuals in the UK and elsewhere for seeking to exercise their basic rights. Ministers have raised these concerns with the authorities during recent visits both to Hong Kong and to Beijing. The continued safety of Hong Kongers remains a priority for this government. Whilst it would not be appropriate for me to comment on individual cases, I want to be clear that we will not tolerate any attempts by foreign governments to coerce, intimidate, harass or harm their critics overseas, especially here in the UK. Now, we have received assurances from counter-terror policing that the appropriate measures are in place for the individuals in question, and we regularly assess potential threats to the UK and use all levers available to us to counter them. Where we identify individuals at heightened risk, we are front-footed in deploying protective security guidance and other measures as appropriate. Anyone acting to coerce individuals in the UK is liable to prosecution under the National Security Act. And to date, there have been 6 individuals charged under the new Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government's position is clear. We will protect the rights and freedoms of all individuals in the UK, and we will use every available power and tool to uphold the principles we hold dear.
Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Look, this is an incredibly serious issue. The Chinese Communist Party is an authoritarian regime which has been persecuting people in Hong Kong, mainland China and elsewhere for some time. 100 people nearly have been arrested for political reasons in Hong Kong that we know about since July of last year. And it is completely unacceptable that this harassment and intimidation takes place now on British soil. It is a gross infringement of the liberty of the individuals concerned, and it is an affront to British sovereignty. Now, bounties have apparently been placed on 3 people who are in the United Kingdom, amounting to approximately £100,000 each. Tony Chung, aged 23, Carmen Lau, aged 30, and Chloe Chung, aged only 17. All of them fled Hong Kong owing to persecution. Chloe Chung apparently was advised by the police to dial 999 if she felt under threat, which strikes me as an inadequate response. I understand that posters appeared near the home addresses of 2 of these people, and letters were posted to their neighbours offering a reward if they were, quotes, delivered to the Chinese embassy. This is completely unacceptable, cannot be tolerated, and robust action must be taken. So I've got a couple of questions to put respectfully to the Security Minister. Firstly, has the Chinese ambassador been summoned by the Foreign Secretary to the Foreign Office to have it explained to him this is unacceptable and to ask what is being done to stop this? My understanding is that no such summons has been issued, which is unacceptable. Does this not make clear that giving the Chinese permission to build a mega embassy in London is completely inappropriate? It will simply be used as a pan-European base for Chinese spying. Are investigations underway into the perpetrators of this, and why isn't China being placed into the enhanced tier under the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme? Surely China should be placed into that scheme, into that tier as a matter of urgency. What is the update on these Chinese police stations that have been operating covertly in the United Kingdom? I was briefed on that as Police Minister a year or so ago. Where are we with those? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Security Minister says we won't tolerate this happening. I'm sure the whole House will agree with that, but what concrete and tangible action is being taken to prevent these outrages?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Shadow Home Secretary for the points that he has raised and the question that he has posed. Let me, again, for the avoidance of doubt, be absolutely clear about the government's position. The safety and security of Hong Kongers in the UK is of the utmost importance, and the UK will always stand up for the rights of the people of Hong Kong. Let me also say to him that wherever we identify such threats, we will use any and all measures, including through the use of our world-class intelligence services, to mitigate the risk to individuals. Now, he's asked me a number of questions, so let me attempt to respond to them. He asked specifically about raising concerns with Chinese authorities, and I can say to him that concerns have been raised at every opportunity, including by the Foreign Secretary and by the Minister, and I know that the Minister has met with the families and the individuals involved. He specifically raised a point about the Chinese embassy. So let me say to him that a final decision on China's planning application for a new embassy has yet to be made. As I think he will know, Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, in her independent quasi-judicial role, will make the final decision in due course. But the House should be aware that a joint letter sent by the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary to the Planning Inspector on the 14th of January outlines that the Home Office, working with the Foreign Office, has considered the full breadth of national security issues in relation to this planning application. In the joint letter, the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary made clear that for China to be permitted to build a new embassy at the Royal Mint Court site, they want to see the implementation of suitable mitigations for any public order and for national security risks. The Right Honourable Gentleman also asked me about overseas police stations. Now, as I think he will understand, the police have carefully examined these allegations, and we have made clear to the Chinese authorities that the existence of undeclared sites in the UK is completely unacceptable and that their operations must cease. The Chinese authorities have confirmed that they have been closed. Now, the Shadow Home Secretary also asked me about furs. As the Right Honourable Gentleman will be aware, I'm due to be shortly making a statement which will include an update on the implementation of furs, so I'm not going to get ahead of myself. However, what I will say is that furs strengthens the resilience of the UK political system against covert foreign influence and provides greater assurances around the activities of certain foreign powers or entities that are a national security risk. As a result, the UK will be better informed about the nature, scale and extent of foreign influence in the UK. As I think he will be aware, since coming to power in July, we have ensured there are now more people than ever working on FIRS implementation. The case management team have been recruited and are in place in dedicated accommodation, and an IT system has been identified and a contract signed for its delivery. We plan to lay the regulations that underpin the scheme shortly ahead of the scheme going live in the summer.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also spoke to Chloe Chung this morning, and I want to reiterate what the Shadow Minister said. And I just want to ask the Minister if guidance can be given to police forces, not just to give reassurance to Hong Kongers who have a bounty or a threat on them, but to take target hardening and security work to ensure that they are safe in their own homes in the UK and not under threat of abduction. It's a real, serious and live threat, and we need to do more than just tell people to call 999.
Minister.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for raising that important point. I mean, I can reiterate the point that I've made specifically in this case, that we sought and received assurances from counter-terror policing that the appropriate measures are in place for the individuals in question. On his broader important point around transnational repression, I can say to him and to the House that the Defending Democracy Task Force is reviewing the UK's approach to transnational repression to ensure that we have a robust and joined-up response across government and law enforcement, and the government will update on the conclusions of this work in due course.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Shadow Home Secretary for raising this appalling incident, and also on behalf of I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, whose constituents have been affected and who have received some of these letters. But also for me, this is a reminder of the pernicious threat we all face as the Chinese government evidently tries to infiltrate every level of British society. I've been filmed by a drone while I was filming at a pro-Hong Kong democracy rally in Edinburgh. Members have been sanctioned by the CCP. Secret police stations have operated across the UK, including Glasgow. There's the issue of the embassy in London and the attempt for Chinese companies to be involved in our energy provision in a way which, if not mitigated, will threaten our energy security and national security. The list grows longer almost daily. We must strengthen our response to China and make that clear. Stop more of our citizens and brave activists being threatened on British soil. So how will the government bring these bounty hunters in this question to justice? And will they enforce Magnitsky sanctions regime to crack down on Hong Kong and Beijing that are responsible for this and every other insidious attack on our freedoms and democracy?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for the points that she raised. I can reiterate the points that I've made previously, and I can reiterate the point about concerns have been raised at every opportunity. And I can also reiterate the points about how seriously these matters are taken by the UK government. We will use all of the tools at our disposal to ensure that everybody who lives in this United Kingdom is able to go about their lawful business uninhibited by the activity of others in other countries. That is a matter that we take incredibly seriously, and we are working at pace to ensure that every protection is in place.
Adam Thompson.
Speaker, since the launch of the British nationals' overseas visa route for Hong Kongers, more than 209,000 people have been granted a visa, of whom more than 150,000 have arrived in the UK, very much including my community in Erewash. Can I first welcome the government's continuing support for Hong Kongers and ask what steps the Immigration Minister is taking to support the integration of those coming in via the BNO route into the UK?
Stop.
Well, I'm grateful to him for the point that he makes, which is an important one. He will understand that the BNO route reflects the UK's historic and moral commitment to those people of Hong Kong who chose to retain their ties to the UK by taking up this status at the point of Hong Kong's handover to China in 1997. Now, I think you'll be aware that to be eligible for this route, applicants must have BNO status or be the eligible family member of someone with BNO status. And he'll also know, I'm sure, that since the route opened in January 2021, close to 220,000 visas have been granted to Hong Kongers who are making a much valued contribution to communities across the UK, including his own constituency. We will work closely with those constituencies and with those local authority areas to make sure all of those people feel properly valued and supported. And if there are any specific concerns that he has, I'd be very happy to meet with him to discuss them further.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I first of all say that one of the proudest things that I was able to achieve in the last few years was the BNO visa route, which was a correct correction of a mistake that was made by this House nearly 40 years ago, sorry. And I'm very grateful that the Honourable Lady, who was in her place only a few moments ago as Shadow Foreign Secretary, as Home Secretary, was able to introduce it, and the support I got from the Minister at the time was very gratefully received. May I, however, come on to this point about the threats to activists. As somebody who is sanctioned, who occasionally gets letters to my home, occasionally gets text messages from random Hong Kong and Beijing numbers, I can only imagine how much more threatening that might be if I had family, if I had connections or relatives in Hong Kong and in mainland China. Can the Minister assure me that he's advertising as widely as possible the role of the counter-terrorism police, not just in fighting terrorism, but also in fighting the state threats that these are appearing before us? Because the reality is we are not today expecting war to take its old nature of massed armies or invasions, we are seeing a pernicious undermining of the confidence in the British state, an undermining of the credibility of our own ability to protect our citizens and our friends. And that is undermining not just our position, but also our economy and the freedom of our citizens.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for the work that he did in government, and he raises some incredibly important and valid points. Let me say to him, first of all, in regard to the point he made about sanctioned members of this House, that is a matter that we take incredibly seriously. It is a matter that the Foreign Secretary personally has raised his concerns about at the highest levels, and it is a matter that we will continue to keep under very, very close review. I thought he made some other important points, and I hope that he would very much join with me in welcoming the additional resource that was announced by the Prime Minister the other day for our operational partners and for the intelligence services. He will know from his previous service what a hugely important role they fulfil in keeping our country safe. He knows, I'm sure, the seriousness with which we attach to these particular matters, and I look forward to continuing to work with him to ensure that on a cross-party basis we maintain our national security.
Alan Gemmell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Director General of MI5 highlighted increasing risks of state actors within the UK. What steps is the Minister taking to support MI5 in protecting the UK from these intrusions?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to him for his question, and I think that this provides a very good opportunity for us, I hope collectively as a House, to pay tribute to the extraordinary work of our operational partners and the security services. By the very nature of their work, they serve in the shadows. It has been an extraordinary pleasure and privilege to work very closely alongside them in recent months. They do difficult work, but they do it incredibly well, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for doing it.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I hear the Minister as somebody else that is sanctioned by the Chinese government, who has been pursued by low-level intelligence operatives around the world, yet falsehoods placed about me in newspapers and to others that I know in government elsewhere. This goes on, and most of all, for those who are here who have fled Hong Kong, what we are seeing is extraterritorial attacks on them in plain view, and yet it seems that nothing ultimately happens. And here, for example, is a copy of a letter that has been put about by an individual, redacted, an individual who has been threatened, and the neighbours have been asked to take him to the Chinese embassy to hand him in and receive the bounty. How much longer are we going to say all these wonderful words in this House about what we stand for? When it comes to those who need our protection, nothing ever seems to happen. What is he going to do about the embassy? That shouldn't be going. Everywhere that they have a super embassy in the world, you see extraterritorial activity grow massively. Will he now reject that and start arresting people responsible and kicking them out of the country?
Well, I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman speaks with very long experience on these matters, and the activity that he describes is completely unacceptable. The government is crystal clear that the kind of activity that he has just described is not acceptable, and we will do everything that we're able to do in order to prevent it from happening. He referenced the embassy. As I think he knows, and I know that he's raised specific concerns about this previously, that a decision on the embassy will be made by Deputy Prime Minister in her capacity as the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. I refer him to the letter that has been written jointly by the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, which takes into account the full breadth of national... The Shadow Home Secretary kind of tuts from a sedentary position. I don't know whether he has read the letter. It's available online. He should read the letter, because the letter takes into consideration the full breadth of national security concerns. This government will stand against all those who seek to repress or behave in the way that he has described, and we will use all of the tools at our disposal to stop it from happening.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Across the UK and indeed in Exeter, where we've got a very large and welcome Hong Konger community, we've seen rising threats from state actors who seek to influence and intimidate peaceful dissidents. Can the Minister update the House on how the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme will help to tackle these threats? Thank you.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, as I will be making a statement shortly. But I can say that we are working at pace to implement the first scheme. This is an important tool in the government's armoury. It will strengthen the resilience of the UK political system against covert foreign influence, and it will provide greater assurance around the activities of certain foreign powers and entities that we know to be a national security risk. We're getting on with the work, and we plan to lay the regulations that underpin the scheme in the near future, ahead of it going live in the summer.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to represent a substantial community of Hong Kongers in Richmond Park. And I've just been looking in Hansard, and I noticed on their behalf I was last here 2 months ago to ask the government about renewed reports of repression against Hong Kongers in this country, and yet here we are again, and in the meantime nothing will have been done to reassure my constituents about their continued safety and security in this country. I was interested in the Minister's response to the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, where he talked about reviewing transnational repression, and I would just urge him to give some more detail about when we in this House and my constituents in Richmond Park can expect to hear more about what the government plans to do on this.
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I think she makes a very important point, and let me give her an absolute assurance that these are matters that we take incredibly seriously, and that is why, through the Defending Democracy Task Force, which I chair, we have continued a process that was initiated by the previous government to review the issue of transnational repression. I can say to her, for the sake of clarity, that any attempt by any foreign government to coerce, intimidate, harass or harm critics overseas, undermining our democracy and the rule of law, is completely unacceptable. Now, we have at our disposal now the National Security Act of 2023, and that does enable law enforcement and the security and intelligence agencies to deter, detect and disrupt the full range of modern-day state threats, including actions which amount to transnational repression. As I say, the Defending Democracy Task Force is looking very carefully at the issue of transnational repression. There has been a lot of work taking place across government, and we will have more to say about it shortly.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Birmingham has a large and growing community of people from Hong Kong. While most are now well settled into the wider community, some of my constituents are fearful about continued monitoring and surveillance, especially if they speak out on human rights. So can the Minister give me and my constituents an assurance that if they are subject to those utterly unacceptable practices, then they will receive protection and support?
I'm grateful to him for his question and for his representation of his constituents. Yes, I can give him that assurance. Hopefully my comments today convey the seriousness with which we attach to this particular issue. We work incredibly closely with counter-terrorism policing and with policing right around the country and with operational partners and the intelligence services, and I can absolutely give him the assurances that he seeks on behalf of his constituents.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister very much for his answers to all of the questions. The activity of Chinese operatives within our shores has got to stop, and no steps taken thus far have deterred the Chinese from overstepping on our shores. If those who legally and peacefully oppose China are not safe on our shores, then just where are they safe? Bounties on people's heads is like something from a film. However, this is real life for the living lawfully in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland right now. So what is the Minister going to do to tell China that the line has been crossed and that there will be consequences? Thank you so much.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member, as I always am, and he's got a very long-standing track record of standing up for repressed minorities, wherever they might be. And clearly that is particularly relevant in the context of today's urgent question. He will have heard my opening remarks where I referenced the statement that had been issued by the Foreign Secretary condemning specifically, in this case, those bounties, and that the Foreign Secretary had said that we call upon Beijing to repeal their national security law, including its territorial reach. We take these matters incredibly seriously. We're working with the police, we're working with local communities, and we will do everything that we can to make sure that people get the support that they deserve.
James Nish.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to come back to the embassy. I've been contacted by several constituents on this issue. At 700,000 square feet, it would be China's largest embassy in Europe. And as we know from the incident at the Manchester Consulate in 2022, such an embassy would be contributing to the transnational repression that Hong Kongers, Tibetans and the wider Chinese diaspora in the UK experience. Can the government confirm whether it has made an assessment of whether this new super embassy would contribute to transnational repression? And if so, on what basis that assessment has been made?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for the question that he asks. It's a question that has been asked by others. I mean, the assurance that I can give him is that national security is the overriding priority for this, and I hope any government. Of course, we look incredibly carefully at these matters. Of course, we will consider every aspect of this application, which ultimately is a decision to be made by the Deputy Prime Minister. But as I've said previously, both the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary have written a very clear letter. I invite those members who appear not necessarily to have read it to read it. And I can tell him and tell the House that the letter covers the full breadth of national security issues in relation to this particular planning application.
Bob Blackmore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister is talking, obviously, about the national security position in relation to the super embassy. The reality is, if the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary wrote in January in relation to this particular application to the Deputy Prime Minister, who has to make that decision, will he now, in the light of the new information that has come available, review that letter and actually take advice on whether actually the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary should be writing to the Deputy Prime Minister recommending that this planning application is refused rather than taking all these things into account?
Minister.
Well, I understand the concerns that he's raised. He will understand that I've already referenced the letter that was written back in January. If new evidence comes to light that is material to this particular planning application, no doubt that that is a matter that will be looked at very closely, both by the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary. But I can give him and the House an assurance that we take these matters incredibly seriously. Of course, we look very closely at them. And of course, the letter that was written on the 14th of January does consider the full breadth of national security implications.
Blair McDougall.
Yeah, I draw out to my role as chair of the all-party group on Hong Kong. I welcome the Minister's recognition that the bounties on the heads of these British Hong Kongers is for exercising rights that are guaranteed to them under the joint declaration. And I don't wish to repeat what other honourable and right honourable members have said, Madam Deputy Speaker, but at some point when ministers come to the House again and again to talk about the infiltration of the royal family by Chinese agents, or the putting of bounties on people's heads or secret police stations, at some point this does have to have consequences for the relationship with China. But can I ask a practical question? That the fear that those who have bounties on their heads here fear is nothing compared to those who remain in Hong Kong and fear they may not be able to leave. And I wonder what practical assistance we can give to Hong Kongers who have had either their B&O passports seized or their other travel documents frozen so that they are able to come to the safety of the United Kingdom.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to him for the work that I know that he does through the APPG and the very long-standing interest that he has in this particular matter. And I'm grateful to him also for the practical question that he has posed. Let me just firstly say to him that B&O status holders and their families are making significant contributions to our economy and local communities. And he asked an important point specifically about passports. Can I assure him that there is no requirement for a person's passport to be valid in order to make an application to extend leave or apply for indefinite leave to remain under the B&O route? And the point that he's made specifically about those who remain in Hong Kong, I know will have been heard by colleagues in the Foreign Office, but I'd be very happy to discuss it further with him, should that be helpful.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Intimidating and placing pro-democracy Hong Kongers living in the UK in a wanted list and circulating reward notices to their neighbours is simply unforgivable, and I'm sure he'll agree that there is no trade deal worth subverting our values and allowing the rights of our people to be abused in such an appalling fashion. And could he tell me what discussions his department has had directly with the Chinese ambassador? What has the ambassador been told that the consequences will be for those found to be responsible for this? And could he tell us what is the status of the current investigation? Or does everybody just accept this matter is now closed?
Minister.
Well, I understand why he raises these concerns in the way that he does. I hope that he can be reassured that the UK government does take these matters seriously and does take every opportunity to raise these concerns at the appropriate level. That is a matter that's taken very seriously by the Foreign Secretary and by the Home Secretary. We will continue to do everything that we can to protect the public in our country.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I met recently at the Lunar New Year celebrations with some of the democracy activists who have had bounties placed upon them. The fear in that room was palpable. People chose not to attend that event so that they wouldn't be photographed with the people that have bounties on their head, and I fear that chilling effect is already very real. So I thank the Minister for confirming that transnational repression is part of the Defending Democracy Task Force, but could he give us a bit more detail on what practical measures can be put in place now to better protect those with bounties on their head in the UK and their family members, which they are deeply concerned about in terms of knock-on effects of impact of them if they are still in Hong Kong?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to him for his question, and I completely understand the point he made about the fear that is felt and the chilling effect that will exist, I'm quite certain, in a number of communities. He's asked me for practical measures. Could I just gently ask him just to be a little patient, because I will have more to say about these matters very soon.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government from bench and members on this side of the House have asked the Minister several times about whether the Chinese ambassador himself has been summoned to be held to account for these actions. So I think this House deserves an answer from the Minister, if I'm totally honest, Madam Deputy Speaker. And moreover, can the Minister just explain a little bit, because a lot of these people are now facing kidnap plots. What investigations are being undertaken into those? And could the Minister update the House in that order as well, please?
Minister.
Well, he will know from his time in government that, in the first instance, these will be matters that relate to the Ambassador for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. But I can give him the same assurances that I've previously given, that the UK government takes these matters incredibly seriously and raises them at every opportunity. He specifically asked about investigations. I can say that the police are working incredibly hard alongside operational partners and will investigate all of these matters using the appropriate resource in order to bring perpetrators to justice and ensure that where people have been targeted, where they are victims, that they will be provided with the support that they both need and deserve.
Mark Sewards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today I spoke with Chloe Chung, the youngest person to be sanctioned under the National Security Law, and I know that she'll at least be pleased to have been referenced by both sides of the House today. Now, Chloe conveyed to me the anxieties and the concerns of the Leeds Hong Kong community, and these were not new to me given the conversations that I've been having with that community. They form a substantial part of my constituency, Leeds South West and Morley. I understand the Minister can't comment on specific cases, so I have two general questions. The first is, what assurances can the government give? Can they give a cast iron guarantee that in any future trade deals with China won't compromise the protections that we've offered Hong Kongers living in the UK? And the second question I have is about MI5. Would the government consider facilitating a meeting between MI5 and those Hong Kongers who have been essentially had a bounty put on their head as a result of the national security law? Would he facilitate that meeting to ensure that there are robust protections in place for those that have been sanctioned?
I'm grateful to him. He is an assiduous constituency MP. I know he's raised the plight of his constituent previously in this House, and I'm grateful to him for doing so. In terms of the points that he's raised, let me just say to him, with regard to his first point, that national security is the first priority of this government. And with regard to his second point, I think probably it is more a matter for counter-terrorism police and for West Yorkshire Police as well. But I've heard what he said. I will take it away and I'll come back to him with a fuller response.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I first of all thank the Shadow Home Secretary for bringing this important question. I'm lucky enough to represent one of the largest Hong Kong communities in my constituency of Sutton and Cheam, and they tell me that the proposed Chinese super embassy is a chilling prospect for Hong Kongers who have moved to our country to escape repression in Hong Kong. As we all understand, the decision is with the Deputy Prime Minister to consider at the moment. But surely the Minister agrees that it is unconscionable that a foreign state be allowed to massively enhance their operations in this country as they flagrantly conduct extrajudicial acts on the streets of the UK. If permission is given, does the Minister also agree that it will undermine any words and assurances given that foreign states will be held to account for hostile actions targeting British residents on British soil?
Well, given his strong constituency interest, I completely understand why he raises his concerns in the way that he does. I mean, I hope that he and other honourable members will understand that from a national security perspective, we take these matters incredibly seriously. There is a limit to what I can say about the specifics of this particular case, but let me put it in a slightly more diplomatic way than I might normally seek to do so, that there seems to be something of a misunderstanding about the circumstances of this particular case. I can give him an absolute assurance that we look incredibly carefully at these matters. Some of the suggestions that have been made are not correct. There is a process that is underway. I'm legally bound not to interfere with that process. No honourable member would expect me to do so, but I point him again to the letter that has been written by the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, very carefully considered, which includes the full breadth of national security issues with regard to this application.
Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend will know that the Joint Committee on Human Rights is currently conducting an inquiry into the important issue of transnational repression. Will he commit to looking at any recommendations that come out of that inquiry very, very carefully so we can ensure we've got the correct measures in place to make sure that we are upholding the fundamental British values of democracy here in the UK and, of course, safeguarding our national security?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to him. I do know about the Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry. In fact, I believe that I'm due to give evidence to it. So yes, I can absolutely give him an assurance that we will look very carefully at the findings of that important piece of work. I've written to the Chair about it. I look forward to meeting the committee and to giving evidence, and I look forward to progressing the work through the Defending Democracy Task Force so that we will be able to say more about the work this government intends to do against the issue of transnational repression.
Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recently met Jimmy Lai's son, Sebastian, and his legal team, and I was absolutely horrified to hear that his UK legal team from Doughty Street Chambers have recently gone for a concerted and coordinated campaign against him, including intimidation, surveillance, hacking of bank accounts, and rape threats aimed at their children. It appears the Chinese state is now undermining our legal system. The Minister has repeated today at the dispatch box that this government will take all steps to prevent persecution against Hong Kong nationals in the UK. So will he support mine and my honourable friend for Bicester and Woodstock's call for high-profile visits by UK and Chinese officials in our respective countries to be paused until this security situation is resolved?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising the case of Jimmy Lai, and I've also met with Sebastian Lai. So I can tell him that Jimmy Lai's case is a priority for the government, and we've made this clear in our engagements with China. We call on the Hong Kong authorities to end their politically motivated prosecution and immediately release Jimmy Lai. The Prime Minister raised his case with President Xi at the G20 summit in November. The Foreign Secretary raised with China's Foreign Minister in October, and Minister West raised this with Hong Kong officials during her visit to Hong Kong in November.
We now come to the statement on Iranian state threats. Security Minister Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be back. With your permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement on the growing threat to the UK from Iran and the steps the government is taking to combat these threats. The threat from Iran sits in the wider context of the growing, diversifying and evolving threat that the UK faces from malign activity by a number of states. The threat from states has become increasingly interconnected in nature, blurring the lines between domestic and international, online and offline, and states and their proxies. In the last year, the number of state threat investigations being run by MI5 has jumped by 48%. This statistic is a stark indication of the increased threat. Now, turning specifically to Iran, the regime has become increasingly emboldened, asserting itself more aggressively to advance their objectives and undermine ours. This is evidenced by the fact that direct action against UK targets has substantially increased over recent years. The Director General of MI5 recently stated that since the start of 2022, the UK has responded to 20 Iran-backed plots presenting potentially lethal threats to British citizens and UK residents. The Iranian regime is targeting dissidents, and it is targeting media organisations and journalists reporting on the violent oppression of the regime. It is also no secret that there is a long-standing pattern of targeting Jewish and Israeli people internationally by the Iranian intelligence services. It is clear that these plots are a conscious strategy of the Iranian regime to stifle criticism through intimidation and fear. These threats are unacceptable. They must and will be defended against at every turn. Now, it is testament to our world-leading law enforcement and intelligence services that through their tireless commitment, so many plots have been thwarted, and I am sure that the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the brave men and women of our law enforcement and intelligence agencies who work day in, day out to keep us safe. In seeking to tackle this threat, we must understand it. The Iranian intelligence services, which include the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, or MOIS, direct this damaging activity. But often, rather than working directly on UK shores, they use criminal proxies to do their bidding. This helps to obfuscate their involvement while they sit safely ensconced in Tehran. We see that in intelligence, but we've also seen it publicly with the conviction in 2023 of the Chechen-born Austrian national who was imprisoned for conducting surveillance on Iran International's UK headquarters. Now, these threats are not only physical in nature. The National Cyber Security Centre has also seen malicious cyber activity conducted by Iranian state-affiliated actors targeting a range of state sectors, including in the UK. The government is absolutely committed to ensuring that our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have the tools they need to disrupt and degrade the threats that we face from Iran. So, I can announce today that we will place the whole of the Iranian state, including Iran's intelligence services, the IRGC and MOIS, onto the enhanced tier of the new Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. The Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, or FIRS, is a critical disruptive tool for the UK. This action will mean that those who are directed by Iran to conduct activities in the UK, such as criminal proxies, must register that activity, whatever it is, or face 5 years in prison. They will face a choice: expose their actions to the government or face jail. Now, the Home Office will lay regulations in Parliament as soon as possible, with a view to having the scheme up and running by the summer. On prescription, as members will know, we do not routinely comment on groups being considered for prescription, but I can assure the House that we do and will continue to keep the list of groups considered under constant review. However, what has become increasingly clear is the challenges inherent in applying our existing counter-terror legislation to state and state-linked threats to our national security. This challenge was first raised by the Home Secretary in opposition. She warned of a lack of a comprehensive strategic approach for state threats to mirror that adopted on terrorism, and the specific difficulties in using a prescription mechanism designed for groups like Al-Qaeda on state bodies. Now, we are progressing work at pace to address this challenge. So I can announce today that Jonathan Hall, KC, has been asked to review the parts of our counter-terrorism framework which could be applied to modern-day state threats, such as those from Iran. This includes giving specific consideration to the design of a prescription mechanism for state and state-linked bodies, providing more flexibility than is offered under the existing powers. As the independent reviewer of both state threats legislation and of terrorism legislation, Mr. Hall is perfectly placed to undertake this review, and we are grateful for his agreement to provide this advice. Let there be no doubt, we are utterly determined to stay ahead of those who threaten our country, and any step that could aid us in that critical endeavour will be considered. But the UK is not alone in facing these threats. States across the Western world are threatened by Iran. So we will work with our allies to better understand, expose and condemn Iranian actions and bring Iranian-linked criminals to justice wherever in the world they may be. We regularly collaborate with our Five Eyes and European partners to protect our democracies from hostile Iranian attack. And here at home, we are going further too. The National Security Act of 2023, which was supported on both sides of the House, has given the police new powers to target evolving activity. For example, the Act criminalises assisting a foreign intelligence service, such as the IRGC or MOIS. The maximum penalty for these offences is 14 years in prison, the same maximum as for a prescription offence. And I can also announce that training and guidance on state threats activity is now being offered by counter-terrorism policing to all 45 territorial police forces across the UK. This will mean that when any frontline officer encounters a suspected state threats incident, they will know what to do and what to look for to ensure that our communities are kept safe. Furthermore, we have recently issued guidance on the National Security Act and how it applies to the UK security profession, including private investigators. This ensures that they are aware of the law and understand where they might be criminally liable if they were working for any foreign power, such as Iran. We will also continue to go after the criminal networks and enablers that Iran uses to carry out its work. The leader of the Zindashi organised crime group, a group frequently used by the Iranian regime, has already been sanctioned. But we will explore further sanctions against other Iranian-linked criminals, and the National Crime Agency will target those who assist the IRGC and others to launder their money. Alongside the recently launched Border Security Command, which strengthens Britain's border security and disrupts criminal smuggling gangs, I have asked officials to consider new ways to enforce our robust immigration rules to specifically address threats from Iran. This work will focus on further protecting the UK from Iranian infiltration, including those who promote Iranian interference in the UK. I am clear that our response must be a UK-wide effort, so I welcome the Charity Commission's statutory inquiries into both the Islamic Centre of England and the Al Tawhid Charitable Trust. I've also asked officials to review where any Iranian interference is being conducted in the UK, and FIRS will shine more light on any undisclosed relationship between the Iranian state and UK-based institutions and individuals. Finally, the National Protective Security Authority and Counter-Terrorism Policing will continue to provide protective security advice and support to individuals and organisations threatened by the Iranian regime and its criminal proxies, including Persian language media organisations and their employees. And we will continue to main funding for protective security measures to synagogues, Jewish community centres and schools, ensuring we do all we can to keep our Jewish communities safe. Madam Deputy Speaker, in a dangerous, volatile world, Britain must lead the way. And that means proudly promoting our values and straining every sinew to keep our people safe. The measures I've set out today should reassure the House and the public about our unflinching commitment to these objectives. Under this government, security will be the foundation on which everything else is built. We will resist attacks on our way of life as vigorously as we counter threats to life, whatever their source. We will work relentlessly to root out those intent on causing harm on our streets, and we will do whatever it takes to protect our country and our democracy. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Security Minister once again for his courtesy in giving advance sight of his statement. The House should be in no doubt about how serious the threat is posed by Iran. Iran sponsors terror organisations across the Middle East. They are enthusiastic and significant supporters of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of the Houthis in Yemen, and they back Shia militias in Iraq and in Syria. These organisations kidnap, they murder, they rape, and they commit terrorist atrocities. Without Iran's support, these terror organisations would not be able to operate in the way that they do. So Iran bears a heavy burden of responsibility for enabling these terrorist actors to perpetrate atrocities. Let us also not forget that Iran is an enthusiastic supporter of Putin's murderous regime and their invasion of Ukraine. Iran is supplying drone technology to Russia and more recently, according to the Foreign Secretary, has supplied ballistic missiles to Russia, which are being used in furtherance of their illegal and barbaric invasion. There is no question Iran is a hostile state. It promotes terrorism, it undermines freedom, and it undermines democracy. And we have seen recently actions by Iran on British soil. We have seen journalists being harassed to the point that one media organisation had to, thankfully only temporarily, relocate its activities from London to New York. That is completely unacceptable. So, of course, we support the listing of Iran in the enhanced tier of FIRS. We support the government in that. Of course, we'll support the relevant statutory instrument when it comes before Parliament. And I'm glad that the National Security Act 2023 is being used, and I pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge and Malling, who I see is in his place for his work in putting that statute onto our books. But having welcomed this move, I do, of course, have some questions to ask. And essentially, those questions are in this vein. Is merely requiring registration a strong enough sanction? And I put it to the House that it is not strong enough, because under FIRS, all that is required is registration, and that alone is not enough. We have seen our allies, the United States, in 2019 designate the IRGC as a terror organisation. We saw our Canadian allies